Okay. So I'd like to call this meeting of the Amherst School Committee to order at 6:05 p.m. Please note that this meeting is recorded and live broadcast by Amherst Media. And Ms. Duanmi-Cage will not be joining us tonight. So the first order of business, I'd like to approve minutes of February 27th, 2018. I had one comment, which is that, let's see, where is this? It's in the SOI. Ms. Westmoreland, it says in the SOI discussion, where is that? Oh, top of the second page. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to clarify, we'll confirm whether having the word addition as part of the project scope is acceptable to MSBI. My understanding of that conversation was that, or my memory is that it was about making sure that reconstruction was also part of that clause. Maybe that was what was intended to be represented, but is that your recollection as well?
Yeah, I remember the conversation being specifically around that we had outlined renovation and or addition in the language, and so we wanted to clarify that addition, that it wasn't going to somehow leave out the possibility of reconstruction or replacement.
That's the word I was looking for. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or a motion? Yep.
Move to approve the minutes of February 27, 2018 with changes as noted.
Second.
Any more discussion? All those in favor? Great, thank you very much. Okay. All right, announcements and public comment. And I just want to note that we have, we're going to have a pretty substantial presentation from Dr. Morris around, it's the second item under new and continuing business, Superintendent's Formal Enrollment Working Group Response, and we are going to have an opportunity after that for the public to have some questions and answers. If anybody's here specifically for that who would like to comment on that, we'll reserve a little time for that as well. But right now we'll take any public comment that people would like to share. So please step up and identify yourself, and you have 3 minutes.
My name is Irene Duhovne. I'm a parent of Wildwood. I have a request maybe to the school committee. One is if in the future when they are aligning curriculum days, if they could look also at the calendar of the 5 colleges. This week, the 5 colleges are off. A lot of the population is related, the kids are related. And last Friday, we have a curriculum day. So many parents had to find ways of covering things where this week it would have been much easier to cover things. So in the future, try to align, if possible, curriculum days when the universities are off. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Any other public comment? Yes, please step up.
Hi, I'm Tony Cunningham, parent of a second grader at Wildwood and a preschooler. I'm not in the district. So I'd like to thank the superintendent and the school committee for creating the enrollment working group to study the different challenges facing our elementary schools. I look forward to hearing the superintendent's response tonight and the preschool subgroup's presentation. This was a great opportunity to take advantage of the expansive skills, knowledge and energy of members of our community. I would encourage the school committee to continue this outreach to the broader community and to include community members in decision making whenever possible. As you may know, I was opposed to the previous school building project plan primarily because of the proposed grade reconfiguration and putting 750 students in one building on the Wildwood site. In addition, I felt the previous plan failed to adequately address some of the challenges facing our district and would have created some new problems that don't currently exist. I hope that the educational plans for future construction projects will take into account the research of the enrolment working group and any further research that follows on from this work, resulting in plans that we can all enthusiastically support. I'm especially excited about the prospect of a dual language program in one of the elementary schools and the exploration of world language instruction at the other 2 schools. The subgroups report and the follow-up presentation by MABE on how such a program could be implemented was extremely helpful. In both the Charter Choice Survey and the preschool parent research undertaken by UMass students, language immersion was shown to be a key factor in why families choose charter. Getting language instruction into our elementary schools will likely help retain families in our district and lessen the subsequent financial impact to the budget. The special needs subgroup did good work surveying the experiences of families in the current specialised programming. I would encourage the school committee to consider the group's recommendation of offering choice to those families who participate in the specialised programmes, to allow siblings to attend the same school and allow kids who no longer require the specialised programme to remain where they are. In addition, I would support the group's suggestion to form a working group to study how other school districts with similar configurations as ours provide these services to their students. I look forward to hearing the superintendent's recommendations tonight and seeing positive progress in addressing the challenges before us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, do we have any other public comment? Okay, great, thank you. And announcements from the school committee, yes?
So I just want to take a few minutes to embarrass you, Ms. Howard, because this is your last Amherst School Committee meeting and your last as chair, and I've really enjoyed working with you in the 1 year that we've overlapped. And I think above all else, I really admire how selflessly you approach the job. It's, to me, the #1 characteristic of a good public servant. It's like the servant part of public service. And like, you will never be your own cheerleader, and you know, my goal is just to say thank you, hopefully make you as red in the face as possible, because you know, our community needs to know that, you know, this job requires a lot of effort. It's a big sacrifice, and our school district is much better as a result of your work, so thank you.
Thank you, that's very kind. And I appreciate, I just want to say that I appreciate everyone at this table and in the district who's I've had the opportunity to work with, and in the town. It's just been quite an amazing experience, you know. I mean, there are things that I won't miss, and there are things that I will definitely miss, and that's certainly having the opportunity to work with people who are so committed and intelligent, and just it's just, you know, very, very interesting process, and I've learned a great deal, and I really appreciate the support of community members who have, you know, worked behind the scenes to help us with what we do. So my appreciation. Yeah.
So this is the only opportunity I'm going to throw on the pile. I think you've done an exceptional job as chair. I think because I chair a different body of, you know, of the school district, it gives me hope. I don't know if it's unique or not, but it gives me some insight into how hard the job is, and also a lot of the things you have to think about. And every step of the way, you've really impressed me with the combination of your knowledge and caring about a lot of the substance of what we're dealing with, but also your political judgment, your wisdom, and your discretion around how you organize the work that we're doing, and also how thoroughly you prepare. As somebody who, as you've noticed, pretty much never has notes in front of them, you've made me increasingly nervous as to my habit of operating basically sort of on the fly, because I can see how extremely well it works for you, that you're really diligent, you're extremely well prepared, and that shows in the quality of the work we've done. We wouldn't, as people have said to me about the work of our school committee as a whole, you don't, I don't know how to say this, I don't mean it negatively about anyone else, I mean it positively about what we're doing. That you don't get off the front pages of the newspaper by accident, and you don't create a body of work like the enrollment working group and the progress you've made by accident. You do it through a lot of really thoughtful work and a lot of work with that community that you described a moment ago, and I just think you've done a wonderful job of it.
Thank you. And I think that, you know, I appreciate the ability to work off the cuff. So, you know, goes both ways, goes both ways. Yes. This is the Academy Awards.
That's a good idea. We should have actually brought a little Academy Award.
Well,
or
Peter was saying,
something.
did anybody see the musical? What happens when you're voted off the spelling team? You get a juice box.
Oh, we should bring
Bring me a juice box.
Next time.
Next time.
Next time. Well, I just want to take a moment also to thank you, Ms. Hazard, for all of your service. And I don't know if this is widely known, you actually recruited me onto the school committee because we and I shared sort of similar interests and ideas, and I really also have to echo what my colleagues just mentioned now about your hard work and your diligence and your open-mindedness. I think you, more than anyone that I have encountered in this work so far, is just really willing to listen to multiple sides. And this is not an easy position to have, both as a member and I think especially as a chair. So thank you so much for your service and for your personal sacrifice. And thank your family also, because you have 2 young children. I know a lot of people know this also. And that is especially difficult to do when you have 2 young children at home. And they're everything. So thank you very much for everything you've done for us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and I look forward to the work that continues from this group, which I feel like is functioning really well with Dr. Morris at the helm. I can't say enough, obviously, about, how great it's been to work with you, so.
I'll be brief, and I won't add to the embarrassment, right? I wasn't going to say anything negative, but I wasn't going to add to the embarrassment. No, in all seriousness, I agree with what was shared, and I think how I view your leadership this year is the result. So you took on as chair at a particularly frayed time in the Amherst Public Schools in terms of people had strong feelings on a variety of issues, the building project being the largest, there being other ones as well. And we're now in a place where we're going to get the 5th outstanding report, because we've seen it tonight, and moving forward with some thoughts about how we're able to do that. So think of the sea change in terms of how people have been included and connected to the meaningful work, and that we have a path forward from where we were last year at this time, where it wasn't quite clear where that path was. So a lot of that is due to your leadership and your chairpersonship. I don't know how to say that well. That's the best I can do tonight. But I think in addition to all the other comments, I think the results of your leadership are really clear, and I think sort of fitting that tonight is your last meeting when we have the last presentation from the enrollment working group, my response to it, and then you get to go bon voyage and be a spectator, right?
That's right, which I will do.
Which is a nice thing, but I think the kind of positive irony or serendipity of the moment wasn't lost on me when I was preparing for the meeting and thinking that this was your last meeting as chair, to think about where we've been and then where we are tonight and then where we're going to go. So thank you for your tireless efforts over the last 3 years, but particularly over the last year and your leadership.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Morris, did you have another announcement you'd like to
I
make?
did want to say something because so Monday night, the meeting ran long. I have a sneaking suspicion that tonight might happen as well. So I just want to acknowledge, I know safety's on here, but this isn't really a safety discussion. At the elementary level, and I know some of the principals aren't here, some of them are coming. There's an event at Fort River, so that got a little complicated for Diane. Just how beautiful the elementary principals in Amherst led events at their school today on a day that was much more focused on secondary students nationally. Just really thoughtfully with upper grade students, the inclusive piece, and what students were able to share, and the participation was really high. Some beautiful pictures from Crocker Farm of students walking up to Shea Street and acknowledging things in a very developmentally appropriate way. And as opposed to the high school and middle school, which can be more student-led, at the elementary level, certainly there was student voice, but the principals had to play a larger role just because the students are 10, 11, and 12. And how they were able to both make sure that the developmental appropriateness and the emotional safety was part of it, knowing that there's 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in our buildings, as well as the emotional safety of our emerging adolescents, and how students were so central. Like they were able to figure out a way to do both, to control the situation enough where it was safe, and to allow student voice to be the central theme. And that's not easy to do at the elementary level. And so I just wanted to say that up front, because I know by the time we get to safety, might be a while from now, and not everyone might be able to be here. But it was really important to me, well, the high school and the students who went to downtown certainly get the media, kind of the quieter moment of, at a large scale in terms of media coverage, but no less meaningful was seeing upper grade students participate and seeing incredibly powerful lessons around community and unity from the youngest students to the oldest students. It was really beautiful at the elementary level. So I just wanted to say that up front. I know my update got moved because we don't want to keep people waiting more than I've already done that, contributed to that.
Thank you for waiting.
But I thought it was worth stating with more people here than might be here when we get to there.
And I have heard numerous comments throughout the community about just the leadership from the administration in preparation for this, and that it's just very much, appreciated around situations that's, of course, incredibly difficult and incredibly important for us to address appropriately. So, thank you. Okay, so moving on. We're going to first hear the preschool enrollment working group, and I just want to note that Dr. Morse's enrollment working group response, it may be we're scheduled for an hour. We may end up going a little bit over on that. I just want to sort of to have that be prepared because we really want to give that due diligence and, but I think we can kind of scoot things around a little bit in a way that will be okay. Okay, so without further ado, this is our final group from the Enrollment Working Group who looked at preschool and preschool access. So thank you very much all for being here. So as you come, you probably have your all prepared, but please make sure you introduce yourselves so we all know who you are.
Hello, I am Mangla Jagdish, second grade teacher at Wildwood. This is Michelle Regan Ladd. She's the Amherst Public School preschool coordinator. This is Paula Lima Jones. She is the parent of a preschooler and of a first grader at Crocker Farm. And this is Amber Cano Martin, who is the parent of a preschool-aged child. Our subcommittee reviewed the demand, need, and access to preschool at Amherst. We focused on current capacity, issues of access based on financial considerations, transportation needs, and constraints due to hours of operation, and the ability of the district to meet state regulations for enrollment. We're going to start just with a little bit of background information that school committee members already know, but we thought it might be useful for the public to hear. In 2003, the Crocker Farm building project was completed, including a brand-new preschool wing. The school district moved its preschools to Crocker Farm Elementary using an integrated preschool model. An integrated preschool model is one in which children with special needs learn alongside typically developing children in the same classroom. Special needs in this case refers to children with IEPs, individualized education programs. In the 2016-2017 school year, the district was out of compliance with state regulations governing the balance of special education students and regular education students in preschool classrooms. Over the past 2 years, the school committee has been interested in expanding the preschool program. There were plans made as part of the elementary school building project. However, these plans will not be going forward. And I'm going to turn it over to Paula, who's going to talk to you about our findings.
Good evening. So we're going to talk about 3 findings from our report. The first one speaks to the current trends around enrollment of preschoolers in Amherst. So on average, in the last 5 years, there's been about 84% of current kindergartners who've had some previous preschool experience. The remaining 16%, however, who have not had previous preschool experience represent in some overpopulated way our most vulnerable student populations, namely our English language learners and also our families from lower socioeconomics. We wanted to bring this up. It wasn't necessarily something that we came through our own study, but something that we learned in talking to Mike and learning some statistics. But particularly the 16% is something that we wanted to draw the committee's attention to. The second finding is that we are in need of additional preschool slots. This is in part because we need to maintain our compliance with our students with IEPs and students with non-IEPs. As Mangala mentioned, we had fallen out of compliance in 2016, 2017, and was granted a waiver at that time. Given our current structure, currently we are in compliance with the balance. However, our kind of ongoing enrollment structure leaves compliance kind of unpredictable at any given moment. And additional slots would be helpful in mitigating that. So it is all beyond our scope to address what is causing a higher number of students coming to us with IEPs. As our preschool coordinator said, wouldn't everybody like to know? But it was beyond our scope in terms of being able to determine that variable in terms of how do we remain in compliance with our integrated preschool model. And also we wanted to note that our current waiting list over the past few years shows that there is a significant number of regular education students who would like to attend. So there is a growth on that end as well, or a need for the growth. For our third finding, we find that our current preschool configuration is unable to meet the needs and or demands of all families seeking preschool. So again, we do have a high percentage of our kindergartners who've had some previous preschool experience. We took it upon ourselves to focus in on those who had not attended preschool and to try to figure out why. As of December 2017, we had 21 of regular education students on our waiting list for Crocker Farm. In 2016, 2017, that was 15 regular education students on the waiting list. In addition, as of 2017, 7 of those on the waiting list also qualified for a tuition waiver, which in any given year, we only have 5 slots available. So there's greater need than what we have available in terms of cost as well. So the cost, transportation, and lack of space were identified as barriers to preschool access. We had constructed a phone survey of those families this current year who had not had their children in preschool. 7 of those identified cost, 5 families identified transportation, and 3 identified the lack of available slots, specifically at Crocker Farm, as the primary issue with their child not attending preschool. Given that we did have a low number, we want to be cautious and not to over-represent these findings, and really just that these serve more as a guide rather than as predictors of why we have even the 16% that are not attending preschool. So with that, I am going to pass it on to Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Regan-Ladd. I'm the preschool coordinator. I'm going to talk about the research a little bit and then some potential solutions that we thought of. So we know that research shows that high-quality early childhood programs promote social and academic skills, and the acquisition of those skills can close the gap for the most needy children, like children that are economically disadvantaged, dual language learners, and special needs children. I mean, all children, the research shows that all children benefit from high-quality preschool. But an analysis published in Educational Researcher last fall found that given the high cost of special education, grade retention, and dropout of school, the results suggest that a further investment in early childhood education may be the one way to reduce those educational and economic inequities. So our committee came up with some potential solutions to ask the school committee and the administration to consider. One would be to explore opening additional preschool classrooms at another school, whether it be Fort River or Wildwood, to address the current space limitations at Crocker Farm. Consider providing transportation support for families that don't have vehicles and it's hard for them to get their child to preschool. That would be beyond what's offered currently for children on IEPs. Consider expanding the free and reduced tuition slots, or look into receiving state vouchers, which we don't currently use, but that could potentially help families that qualify. Also, another thing is thinking about working with local community leaders and organizations to assist families in the process of searching for a low-cost or free preschool, because they can do that, but it's a bit there's so many agencies involved, it's a little bit cumbersome. So I think it's hard for families to know where to look. Just looking at like the website for the farm workers where you can access resources or vouchers, it's not the most user-friendly website. And if you don't have access to the internet, then you're kind of out. And we also thought about an informational campaign to disseminate information about the social, emotional, and academic gains achieved by children who attend preschool, just to make it more widely known that everybody can benefit from preschool. And that's all we have. So do you have any questions for any of us?
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
As a preschool educator, wondering like what your general feelings are when you talk about like the value of preschool.
Mhm.
You know, I think one common misinterpretation of that is like, oh, you're sitting 3-year-olds in a classroom and getting them academics when they should be out playing. And so I don't know if you could just talk about how the research says the preschool is valuable, but not in maybe the traditional classroom regimented setting that maybe was.
Yeah, sure. So different preschool programs have different philosophies, and some are very play-based and some are more structured depending on the program. And people choose those programs based on their own personal philosophy because it matches with what the preschool is offering. The Crocker Farm Preschool is an integrated model, so it's a balance between play and between structure, so that kids learn how to follow directions, participate in small and large group activities, and yet there is free choice where they can choose to play in areas that they want to play and pursue their own interests. Any other questions for any of us?
Other questions? Yeah.
So thank you all for putting together the work in this group. The one question that I have was actually around the waiting list. So,
Sorry, yeah. Yes.
so 21 students as of December. Do you have any information as to what's happened to those 21 students? I mean, I'm assuming that maybe
A lot of them still call repeatedly, and we haven't had anybody leave. Last year, we had maybe 4 people leave, and I was able to fill most of them, which is unusual, but I was able to mid-year. Because a lot of places are full. I found when I called around, there were maybe one program that answered my email survey about that, and they had a, I don't know if they don't do vouchers, and I don't know if the cost is the problem. But, yeah, I don't know what happens to them, but I do know people keep calling, hoping that there's an opening.
And this is the lowest or lower cost
Yeah,
program
it is the
in
lowest
the
cost
area.
around, yeah.
Thank
Mhm.
you.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, do you know more about the state voucher program, and we don't participate? I don't know if you know more. I mean,
Well,
I don't know, I'd love to
okay.
learn more
Okay.
about it, and also if there's a good reason we're not participating, what the reason is.
I don't know what the history is. I know that I've worked in 2 different districts where we did use it. It does require a lot of paperwork, and it requires the family to qualify. They either have to work or be in school at least 20 hours a week, and they have to be a certain economic range. So they have to go meet with a counselor person through the Farm Workers Council. I think someone in Northampton. There might be someone closer in Amherst. I'm not sure. To go through that paperwork. And then we could get reimbursed for up to the state daily rate, but we're currently not even charging that much. But anyway, we could get reimbursed for whatever the family pays, in the addition up to $38 a day, for instance. And we just have to turn in their attendance. So, I mean, it's worth it because I think we have a lot more people that will qualify here than the 2 districts where we were using it, where I worked before. Yeah, at this point, we don't even charge enough to accept vouchers, but we could work on that. I think it's slowly increasing it. But I would like to help those families out, because as Paula was saying, there are some families that qualify, but we've run out of the 5 slots for free and reduced, so,
Right.
yeah.
So we were talking about assisting families with finding access to free preschool, like the difficult to navigate voucher process. You're talking about access to preschool other than our preschool, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
our slots are full, here, let us
Yeah,
help you with.
yeah, I usually can make phone referrals, and I tend to know who accepts vouchers and who doesn't. I'm not always aware of who has openings, but I can usually make suggestions based on what they're looking for.
And just looking, there is, in your appendix, there's a list of all the current
Right.
openings. And I'm actually really surprised at how few there are.
Yeah, there really are very few.
So,
I
there are just
think,
a handful.
Yeah. Most of them offer a longer day than we do, too. I think that, that makes them more appealing, and people need the longer day. But there are some programs offer just a half day or a longer day. They have a choice.
That was one of my questions, and that's something that I've sort of heard, rumblings about, is the length of the day, and is that something that, we should look at in terms of, providing more access. But it looked like in your phone interviews, at least, that wasn't something that played into people's decision,
Yeah, it
or, yeah.
No.
No
No.
one mentioned.
No one mentioned it.
Or maybe one person mentioned the hours as
Interesting.
being an issue.
I mean, I can say anecdotally that I probably should take more data on this, but anecdotally, this is my 4th year. People do, when they find out the hours, even though it's on the website, they may call and ask questions anyway. Yeah, sometimes they say, well, that's not going to work for me,
Right.
so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's maybe self-selected already.
Yeah, yeah.
So, may I ask, how many families did you try to, I was just curious, like the number, that 16%, how many families was that? And you were, I'm not sure exactly the number you reached, but.
So this year, out of the 121 kindergartners, 13 did not attend
Okay.
preschool. We were able to reach 10 of them.
That's really
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
And just, I'm just curious, does the Family Center have any kind of initiatives around working with, I know that they work with the whole family, so around, or that more gets funneled to the preschool administration? And do you, I'm not implying that this should have been within the scope of your work, but, did you sort of look at any other preschool programs in other districts that might be that might be helpful, or have any thoughts about comparable districts where we might see how they do programming that might be helpful?
No, unfortunately, but to be quite honest, we had a little bit of challenges in terms of the membership number. We kind of
Yeah.
expanded in kind of balloons sometimes. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to, if it was only a 2-person job, be able to keep it as simple. But I mean, that would
Does that
be
seem
something.
like a worthwhile pathway?
I mean, I
possibly?
think particularly in terms of the integrated, like other programs that have integrated models, how do they also contend? Because from what Michelle has shared with us, we're not unique in terms of seeing an increase in students on IEP. So how are they managing? I mean, they also have a finite space, and so how are they managing that process? So that would be something, yeah, definitely we would
Yeah.
look at.
I've worked in a couple of different neighboring districts. Is it still on?
Yeah.
I was at Union 38 for 38 years. 38 years. Union 38 for 27 years, sorry. And they just recently went to all full day, which is, there used to just be one full day classroom. And then Irving, I think Union 28, they have half and full day options. And Pioneer has had a full day for a long time, and I think they have a half day. But I am collecting information just in Amherst. I was asked to find out what other programs are charging for tuition, so I'm almost done with that, and that does indicate what the hours are, so we'll have that information soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't want to segue off this, but I think it's worth noting that when we talk about budget, there was a preschool ad, and so I'll be addressing a little bit, and Michelle and Joanne Smith have looked at other districts around with integrated preschools and what the model is, what the hours are, as you mentioned. So not that work's done, but I know Michelle and Joanne have done a tremendous amount looking at area districts, and Faye, I'm sorry, I didn't see Faye in the corner there, looking at other area district preschools, what their hours are, what the model is. So I think not because of the enrollment working group, but because of our need to make sure we're both in compliance legally and ethically. I know you've done some of that work.
Right.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
Not so much a question, but I think a comment on the potential solutions. Obviously, I think, these are all great options and great ideas. Some of them probably more realistic in our current budget environment than others. The one that's sort of low-hanging fruit is that informational campaign, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I think, disseminating information to the community and probably surrounding communities, right, not just Amherst, helping to share the importance of, social emotional learning, that early, education that takes place in preschool is incredibly important. I always try to balance that against what we think resources are available, because you don't want to encourage people to go to preschool if there's not enough preschool slots, right, and if people are on a waiting list. I mean, I'm heartened by the fact that looking at the list of where there are current openings, it seems like there's, or waiting lists and current openings, it doesn't seem like there's a mismatch at this point, right? Like there's a little bit of, there's a waiting list, obviously, I think at the UMass Preschool Early Education Center. And then it looks like there's some slots still available in one of the preschools that you listed here. So I think that tends, that requires more exploration as to why, where we can fill that need if necessary. But I think at the very least, filling our role about the importance of early education, continuing to kind of beat that drum is incredibly important. There's some great campaigns taking place throughout the country that are focused specifically on that. Some organizations like 0 to 3 that are working on that, and many others. And so I think, having that information coming out from the district on a regular basis, coming out even from the school committee, would be incredibly helpful for especially for parents, young parents, or parents who are just starting out with young children, to make sure that they understand why this is so important and why we're pushing that.
But I think it's also key to note that of the 13 families who had children who didn't attend preschool in our kindergartens, only one did not seek preschool. So that was actually kind of a surprise to us. So yes, the information campaign is a good idea, but we really did have people who were seeking preschool. So we don't have a large group out there who doesn't know about preschool or thinks that preschool is not important.
Just, well, no, please.
I would say I agree with Amangla is saying, but I also, given our low numbers on any of them, the fact that we did, I think it was either 1 or 2, is of interest. Because I think when we initially went into it, we were like, well, does everybody even, we hear a lot if you're in these kind of journals, in these kind of conversations, that preschool has value, but have we kind of operationalized it? Like, what value does it have? What's the impact? And thinking about, this is me wearing my hat as a parent of a kindergartner, or soon-to-be kindergartner, just seeing how much information is out there. Like, I saw the signs, it was going around to the preschools about enrolling in kindergarten, and not necessarily seeing that coming in from a new town about, like, what are the options here? I mean, we do have the UMass and the Apple Harvest Festival, but again, it's not as, I think, comprehensive as it seems like the kindergarten pushes. So it might be interesting to see what that yields.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Dr. Morris.
Oh, I'm sorry, please.
No, I'll
Sure.
yeah, I'll remember.
So it's interesting. I mean, I think the idea of doing the informational campaign makes sense. I'm also just wondering to what extent there either, at what level there is, any coordination or sharing of information between preschool providers in the area, just because when I think about expanding preschool or even making a really dedicated push to expand preschool publicly, which I think would be a wonderful thing to do, absent the question of where the kids go and how you pay for it, which are really huge questions. But I mean, I'm not trying to be funny about it. I'm just saying, like, I mean, it's undoubtedly and unquestionably the right answer. How you get to that answer is really a tough question. But also, there's beyond that the fact that I would assume that if we had a broader and expanded availability of preschool, particularly if it was in some ways aligned or integrated with our K-12 system, and also publicly available and maybe even lower cost, or integrated with the school population as a whole, all of a sudden you'd find your demand, like the demand would match whatever increase in capacity you could think of getting, which means you'd really have to almost re-envision. If you're really going to do it right, you'd have to totally re-envision how you're doing preschool, because you'd have to have a much larger, almost like kindergarten, like a whole larger system to do it, which is probably the right thing to do if you could ever figure out how to pay for it. So in the absent, which is a good thing to do, I mean, but absent that, then the question to me ends up being, how do you try to help families and children not fall between the cracks if you have a dozen providers around the proximate area? How do you, A, share information and help get to them to that place, but then also think about ways in which the different providers in the area can maybe collaborate together, because one place may have a better ability to absorb another kid than another place where, because of the mix of children or whatever it is, it may be too complicated to do that. So it's like a statement that really means a question, because you're the expert on this.
A quick response is there is a CFCE grant that the collaborative has for our Amherst and all the neighboring towns. And we do meet about quarterly, I think. And so there are some other programs that are there, and we always talk about what's going on in our program and our openings and things like that. Just not a lot of programs participate, but they do have the opportunity. They're all invited.
Yeah.
This actually, I'm glad I deferred, because it piggybacks on what Mr. Nakajima said. So a while ago, I'm trying to think, I'm looking, Nick's in the room, and he might remember, a number of us from the district over a couple of years went to see Ron Ferguson's Closing the Achievement Gap conference. 2012, 2013, something in that neighborhood, sound right? And so he has a whole strand of which is Birth to Five. And the thing that the presentation, and particularly this line of questioning about informational campaign, because he's big on that, he actually is big on infant, like, there's 5 things you can do with an infant that make a huge impact, right? And so he's kind of been involved in this work. But on the preschool end of things, I remember him talking a lot about exactly what Michelle said. There's sometimes these structures, not everyone comes, and it's not just a district. It needs to be a district and a town collaboration, because the town is involved in licensing, and there's things that are outside the scope of the district that actually town-wide and community-wide partnering can have much larger impact than if it was one or the other. Either the town was doing it or the district was doing it. So I guess I just want to do, some future thinking about how do we engage the larger community? If Dr. Guevara was here, this is a drum she rightfully beats every year, is what are we doing with the towns 0 to 5? What are we doing with the towns? Because she's also thinking of the students in Pelham, Leverett, and Shutesbury. And how does that become more than a district campaign, but actually the town encompassing more people involved? And there's some positive examples that Dr. Ferguson cites in some of his research about towns that have really taken on the mantle of early childhood in a collaborative way. Because at the end of the day, we actually have not as much access as one might think to early care providers beyond our program. And Michelle, it cited some of the examples where there are connections, but oftentimes municipalities, because they're licensing agents, can be central players and partners in that work.
Thank you. Yeah.
So just kind of a general comment, and then a couple of brief specific questions for Dr. Morris. So I have a hard time hearing any of this and not tying it back into the bigger fiscal picture and public funding of public education at the state level. I mean, there's parallel themes here, right, at the K-12 level of that being chronically underfunded by a couple $2 billion, if you believe the Foundation Budget Review Commission, and higher education being chronically underfunded. And so when I think about information campaign, I don't see the real need as in letting people know that preschool is valuable. I mean, there are aspects to that in talking about, it's not just academics, it's play and engagement and social and all that, but helping the public, and this is more from a school committee perspective, right? Connect the dots between, if we really want universal pre-K, and it's great that people at the state level, there's some governor's candidates this year talking about universal pre-K, that comes at a price. And we can have all the wonderful talk we want about pedagogy and engagement, and none of that happens unless we get a lot more money funneled into our school districts. And to me, that comes back to state level issues. And so, and broadcasting that as a social justice issue. If we're talking about there's an achievement gap, quote unquote, in access to preschool, that those who don't have access to preschool, there's disproportionate number of kids who are economically disadvantaged, then that becomes a social justice issue in terms of public funding. So that's sort of where I think about our best ideas, because I love all the recommendations, and then 90% of them cost more money than we have. So I guess the two small questions I have, Dr. Morris. One is it correct that when we get a regular ed kid in preschool, that doesn't pay for, it's not a self-sustaining model in terms of it pays for the cost of educating that child? Meaning we could, if only we had the space, we could have a really large preschool. I know it costs more on average than what we get back in tuition. I guess this is my first question. And then second, just so I can.
Yeah, no, please.
I'll be done. Is the low-hanging fruit I heard in the recommendations is assisting people to that morass of voucher. I've been through some of these websites in the state, and they're really hard.
Right.
I would imagine that involves staff time and resources, and so. I don't know if you could speak to that about.
Sure. I think the third question is hard to answer, and I want to explain why, which is that in our integrated model, we're reserving slots for students with special needs who don't pay a fee. And we do get some state funding. Now, the irony of the statement about state funding is, as we've talked about here, the grant that our integrated preschool grant is being eliminated. So we're now, next year is our last year. We have a third of what we historically got. So separate from increasing funding, actually, our funding is going the other direction. And so I think the best example I can say for getting to the regular ed piece is if there was a classroom of all regular education students, how would we fund that? Because it's hard to, the mix of the special needs, the providers who work with students who are special needs. We sometimes have regular education students who join us, and actually we identify needs along the way. So it's really difficult to parse that out. If it was, and we did have this during my time at Crocker Farm, actually, and it wasn't me, I take no ownership either way, but we did have a readiness preschool for a couple years. I'm trying to think, maybe 2 or 3, that was much more focused on a model of students who didn't have identified needs and fit a lot of the categories that were cited by the enrollment working group in terms of a population that needed more access to high-quality preschool. Finances were a challenge, transportation was a challenge. So we have some experience with how to do that. but then how to pay for it if those students, and the vouchers thing, absolutely, we should follow up on. The quick answer is yes, and we should dedicate staff time to following up on that recommendation. So I think that's the hard thing is how do you have a group of students who don't pay because we're legally and ethically obligated to support their learning. We have a group of students who do pay, and then we have another group of students who may pay a limited or no, almost nothing to attend because it's the right interest, it's the best interest of students and the best interest of the district. So I think those three are buckets, and how those buckets are configured doesn't necessarily pay for itself. I think if you were to configure things where all the non-special needs students were full pay, that's a different conversation financially, but I think it's a really different conversation educationally as well. So I think that's the conundrum on the finances is to increase the finances, increase slots. We're reducing full pay slots, which then reduces the finances. If we increase full pay, we increase our finances, but then we're missing the demographic that in terms of early childhood education has the least options in the community. So that it's a little bit of a conundrum that way. I don't know if that helped answer your question. It's just like, it's not a finite yes, no.
Can I present something? I've been around long enough that there's this campaign that's been going on for probably 10 years called Early Education for All. It is about universal preschool. So there is a blog. I think it's just called Early Education for All. If it's different, I'll send it along to Mike and he can forward it to you. But there's a lot. It's all research based, and it's really a lot of good information.
Great, thank you. Excellent, thank you very much, and I'm going to give a round of applause. Thank you for all your work. All right, so that's a great segue into our next item. Do you want to say something else, or just? Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Okay, and so our next item is the superintendent's formal enrollment working group response. And as I said earlier, many people weren't here at that point. Following this may be a pretty substantial presentation, and we'll have an opportunity after for both the school committee to respond, and I will offer an opportunity for if anybody from the audience would like to, from the public would like to ask questions or make some comments, we'll have an opportunity for that as well.
Yeah, so just a couple preliminary comments to open with. The first thing is I did a similar presentation with staff this afternoon. Time constraints were very real. And so one of the things that I learned is that I'm going to really take my time on this one because there's a lot of complicated pieces. So I don't say this to be in jest, but get comfortable, right? You're going to be here for a while, right? And I'd rather that than where I felt like I would have done things differently with faculty if time wasn't an object, is there were certain things that went too quickly, and we have 5 distinct reports that I'm responding to with unique recommendations that were incredibly well done, incredibly complex, and I want to give each of those presentations its due as I go through a potential path to explore. So I apologize for the length, but I think if it wasn't a long presentation, it wouldn't be honoring the work that happened over the last 9 months by a collective and then 5 distinct subgroups. I think the only other thing I'll share before I start is that all of the information in this presentation, as well as all the information, all the previous presentations, both the PowerPoints and documents, are on the front page of our website. So if anyone's watching at home or watching here and likes to have the visuals, if you go to www.arps.org, you'll see a link that describes it. It'll open a Google folder with all of the documents from all the enrollment working groups, as well as this slide deck, although I added some slides 20 minutes ago. So, no, more than that, 20 minutes before the meeting started, excuse me, that the staff saw. I was going to pull out from here, and actually I liked them when I did it with staff. I was planning just to do it there. So they're totally stolen from the Jeff subgroup. So thank you, Jeff. So here we go. So I also, one of the reasons it's going to take a while is some people have been, and there's a lot of enrollment working group members here. So this is going to seem repetitive, and for some people who are either watching at home or weren't part of the enrollment working group, I want to actually set a context. So I know for those of you who have sat excitedly through 5 presentations, it's going to be some review for a while, but I think for the larger community, it's important to start that way. So last March, the Amherst Elementary School building project ended. And as part of that project and the debates about it, and it was referenced earlier, there were multiple enrollment challenges that were cited. And so having nothing to do with which way people voted, there were a lot of issues that came up and were acknowledged that there was work that needed to happen. So in response, I propose, and I appreciate the support of the Amherst School Committee, to form an enrollment working group. Email went out to all staff members, all parents, if there was an interest that we had a slot, and fortunately we had 20 some odd people who agreed to join. Some people had commitments that got complicated and weren't able to finish, but I think overall along the way we were at 29 members, either staff members or community members and or parents, guardians who participated in that. As if you just heard the last one, the level of work has been, I think, extraordinary, to the point, I think I shared this at the last meeting, where the facilitator, Dr. Rodriguez, she's been sharing the work of these groups with, in her professional work about evidence and using evidence to come up with claims and recommendations. So she presented at DESE, our state governing agency of education, and she's presenting at a national conference and using certain slides from the working group subgroups. So I really want to just acknowledge and thank those of you here, those of you who aren't. It'd be so different if we had a consultant come and do some of this work. It feels very different that it came from the community. So the enrollment working groups met for pretty significant time last summer, and then intermittently through the fall and early winter, and then at that point each individual subgroup met on its own to finish the group. I think it's important to note that the enrollment working group itself decided to form 5 subgroups through lots of debate and dialogue: socioeconomic balance between schools, special education programs, particularly specialized special education programs, declining enrollment across the district, preschool access, and dual language immersion. There were certainly some of these that even in the vote that you all passed last June that were clear, but we really focused and took feedback and rank ordered in a very collaborative process to identify these subgroups. So grainy pictures because of the lighting, better up there, I suppose. Yeah, I'm looking at the bad one. But it was a robust group, and this is just some images of Dr. Rodriguez and the work of the group. So I'm going to do a quick summary, relatively quick, of the working groups. So we had the first one to present was the socioeconomic balance group, and I'm not going to read verbatim what's on the slide, but it had 5 members, and they really looked at the integration and socioeconomic balance of our schools. And this is the statement they wrote. So these aren't my words, that bottom paragraph. These are the words that have already been shared with the community that came from the subgroup. For each of these, I selected certain recommendations and data points. By no means am I responding to every single recommendation all 5 groups had. It's just not feasible. It's not that we're not considering the ones that aren't in here, but I selected ones that I felt like melded together and will have resonance later in the meeting. So the direct quotes from this subgroup: the school committee may want to consider revising the enrollment policy in order to achieve a socioeconomic balance, either through creating new enrollment zones or pursuing an enrollment model that is not map-based. Some of the data they cited were the economically disadvantaged numbers from the DESE website and a growing disparity between our 3 schools. The bottom bulleted point is something that I did after in response to or actually in research from when they presented. I looked at the kindergarten and first grade students across our district, and because I had a hunch that what was happening wasn't that students were leaving our district and that was skewing the numbers, that it was really that housing patterns or residential patterns are shifting. And I heard from principals at all the schools, but not at the same level of acuteness, that the kindergarten and first grade classes coming in were functionally different demographically than the upper grade classes. And that was true across all our schools, but it was particularly true at Fort River. So the gap of 12% between Fort River and Crocker Farm in this data they presented is actually 16% at kindergarten and first grade, which means actually it's less different in grades 2 to 6 than it is for our youngest students. So that was just some research I did after the excellent work that group did. Again, we made a lot of other excellent recommendations, so it's no disrespect to folks who are here or folks who are watching that I'm not citing all the recommendations of every group. So special education subgroup members are listed: Mary Lee Austin, Diane Chamberlain, Maria Kopecki, and Joanne Smith. I had to abridge their statement because it was lengthy and it didn't fit well on a slide that anyone could read. Just because they formatted it with bullet points and there's no way to kind of sort that out. But what they were looking at are particularly our specialized special education programs, our 3 programs, the ILC Intensive Learning Center at Wildwood, the Ames program at Fort River, and the Building Blocks program at Fort River, and looking at the enrollment of those 3 programs. And they asked a lot of really excellent questions, did a lot of surveying of families in those programs. So just 3 points I want to cite from that report. It was what they found in surveying families was it was important that children attend their school based on residence, where they lived. And then it got more nuanced after that. So, and families really happy with their school experience. Even though those students, 2/3 of them, weren't in their residence, the school they would be zoned to based on their residence, the programming, the staff, and they felt a part of the school community. And so I think it's important to know both of those things. In a perfect world, yes, residence, that's what we would prefer, and we can still be happy, right? So I think the group did a fantastic job not going with kind of broad statements, but really digging into the data and understanding where families are coming from. And the last bulleted point that I want to, these are all quotes directly from their report, was that some of the challenges that families expressed weren't so much that attending a different school in terms of the school life, it was the hours that weren't Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 3 o'clock. It was all the rest of life was really complicated. It was complicated in terms of explaining to neighbors why your child goes to a certain school, having siblings in different schools. So I thought that was a really important point that they cited, and there's certainly more we can do in the school, but actually it brings in mind, and actually not to make an awkward connection back to we don't exist in a vacuum, right? Schools are part of the community, much like the preschool report, thinking about that. And so I thought they did a really fine-grained, they did some fine-grained work on understanding families experiencing and being able to see the trend lines between them and some really high-level data analysis. So we had the declining enrollment subgroup members. So we had Doreen Cunningham, Andrew Grant Thomas, Jeff Lee, who's here. Thanks, Jeff. John McCabe and Tracy, who's here. Thank you, Tracy. And so that was their statement. They looked at lots of data ranging from the survey we did last spring about charter choice, private school choices that families make. They looked at housing data from the town, from the census. I think they were a data-rich group, if I can speak very candidly, and we appreciate that about their work, because much like my previous statement, the declining enrollment doesn't exist in a vacuum either, right? We could talk about the charter choice, but some of it has to do with housing and factors that schools don't typically dig into. It's outside our bailiwick, at least it has been historically for most schools. So I picked a couple of their recommendations. The enrollment trends varied by school, and what's not in the school committee's packet, but you'll see, it's just some of the slides, because I think the visuals on these are actually more compelling than the verbal quotes. They also, based on their analysis of some surveys from families, consider adding a dual language or language immersion program to the ARPS district to interrupt the declining enrollment trend. But actually, I want to show the slides with the graphs because I think it's worth showing. So when I showed this with staff today, these were probably the slides that were the highest engagement slides, because they were able to describe visually what many people have experienced over their 20 years in the district or 25 years in the district. So I'll just summarize. The short story is, in terms of racial demographics, it gets a little bit funky because the multiracial category doesn't go all the way back, so it can affect things. But in general, the Latino percentage has more than doubled in the last 20 years, and the white percentage has gone down, and most of the other racial ethnic percentages have stayed relatively flat, especially if you make some guesses or hypotheses about what the multiracial category did to some of the other ones, some of the other categories. I think particularly compelling on this slide, and this was said to staff, was the orange line and the red line. So the orange line is the percentage of students whose first language is in English. So you can see it goes from, FY 98, so 1998, 12% or so, and this school year, or last school year, it was over a quarter. And that's a marked change demographically. Not surprisingly, the ELL number, which is English language learners, which is that red line on the bottom, also has gone up and more than doubled since 1997. So those are just helpful contextual pieces, and I think I included one more, which is just the raw demographics of the 4 schools. So you can see Marks Meadows in green. It closed that year. That's why it drops off so precipitously. The orange, as an aside, we're in the meeting with staff today, and I recognize that there's staff members who have never heard of Marks Meadow, which made me, Nick, and Derek feel really old, I think. But that's what it is. School on the north side of town on the UMass campus. So the orange is Crocker Farms. You could see, steady, dropped a little, early 2000s, increased, and then it's been gradually increasing and then flattening out. Wildwood saw a drop, increase that you could see that had a large increase. It absorbed almost all of the Marks Meadow population. So you see the Marks Meadow goes down, the Wildwood goes up. And saw a drop, but is kind of stabilized. And Fort River, which is in red, has been the most consistent of the four, just with a relatively steady decline going back all the way from its high point in 1997 to where it is today. So rather than have quotes about that, I thought including the visuals was helpful. And finally, the dual language subgroup members, Andrea Battle, Irina Dejevne is here, thank you, Mickey Gromacki. Phoebe Hazard, who's clearly here, and Margaret Sawyer, who studied dual language. So thank you for being the school committee rep on this. I think that's another opportunity to say that. And so the first two are quotes from their report. I think it's worth reading the first one. The dual language immersion subgroup of the enrollment working group strongly urges the superintendent and school committee to pursue an in-depth exploration of implementing a Spanish-English dual language immersion program within our elementary schools. And as a first step, we recommend the district engage experts to conduct a full analysis, and they mentioned MABE. The italicized part, it was what was referenced earlier briefly, was a group of UMass graduate students in the Eisenberg School of Management who did some focus groups for us in the community, in preschool, and heard very similar things. So I put that on there just to say that the subgroup's work was really supported by what we're hearing from families of our future students. We had Mabe come in last time. I really enjoyed Phyllis Hardy's presentation and the dialogue that came from it, and they've offered to continue to support us this spring. So that's one I can actually check recommendation, right? But it's the check is there's many checks along the way on that, but they're continuing to work with us and support our work. And finally, tonight's presentation, Mangala, Paula, Amber, and Michelle. Since I just gave it, I'm going to not give perhaps as much time to that subgroup, but for me the gestalt is that the preschool configuration is unable to meet the community need, and that the cost of attendance, transportation, lack of available slots are the primary reasons, primary barriers in my words, that we're facing. So it was funny, I was talking to Ms. Hazard, I don't know, it was maybe a month or two ago, and we were having this conversation of this all feels great, and then it's my role to say, now what do we do, right? Or at least what's a path to explore, which is a challenge because all 5 subgroups, I'm glad we did what we did. I'm glad there was 5 subgroups that each had distinct membership and recommendations, and that trying to weave them into an approach, that's a unique challenge, and I think that's what I'm planning to talk about tonight. So thank you for giving me the time to go back and do the quick review of some of the primary findings from my perspective of the groups. So I'm someone who, when talking about complex things, really likes to go back to core principles and then likes to go into the complexity. So for me, and choice is getting to be an awkward word. It has a connotation that I don't enjoy at the moment, and yet when I mean choice is a hallmark of any proposal, choice as it relates to schools, what I'm referring to is within our community, I think it's incumbent, me as a superintendent, if there's going to be a change that family choice and staff choice are a major part of the program. In fact, they're a principle of the program, that we have to involve some level of choice in it. And so for me, the 2 non-negotiables for choice is that no student or family should have to change schools as a result of a shift unless by choice. And non-negotiable number 2 is no student or family should be forced to enroll if we do go down a dual language approach in a program, that there has to be choice involved in that. And one of the things that I've continued, and Mr. Yaffe mentioned this today, one of the things that whatever side however people voted, whatever passions they had about the building project, one thing we heard is families love the school they're in. They feel passionate about the school they're in. They feel passionate about the school community that they're in. And for me, that's one of the takeaways of the building project experience, right? is that there's a lot that could be said about that. But the sheer passion that people had about their school community and their identity, however people, just felt on the specifics of the project came through loud and clear. And so building in a process where current students aren't changing schools, perhaps we include choice for future students. Displacing students is not something I'm interested in doing, despite the enrollment challenges that we have. The second point, and this was referenced in the preschool conversation, is that I can't figure out a great way at the moment, until we get more certainty on future budgets, that we're adding lots of new staff members, or really new staff members, when we're struggling to maintain what we currently have, and frankly not maintaining all that we currently have, as we'll talk about when we get to the budget vote tonight. So I think it's just important for me that I don't want to create a path to explore that's fiscally unrealistic. I don't want to get the community's hopes up, or the family's hopes up, or your hopes up, or my hopes up, frankly, by proposing something that is wonderful and cannot be supported without reducing other things that are wonderful as well about our schools. Also that, my experience, and Phyllis Hardy talked about this, but I think it goes beyond dual language, is starting small and growing over time is typically the best approach for change. One thing that I'm conscious of that I hear from families all the time and experience as a parent is your kid's only in 4th grade once. Your student's only in 2nd grade once. And so doing things right sometimes means doing things slower than people would like. And trying to balance those two is something that I'm highly conscious of as we approach any sort of change in our schools. It's not for lack of urgency. It's actually because the urgency for me is doing the right thing by kids, and doing the right thing by kids means we do things cautiously, assertively when we need to, but we only do things when we can be very confident that's going to have a positive impact on our students. And so there's some tension in that, right? Because students only go to 2nd grade once. And so how to balance those things, those variables, is something that is very high on my brain when I think about responding to the great work of the enrollment working group. A couple other points I want to make. So bilingualism, one thing I've heard, and it was referenced in multiple enrollment working group and other reports, it's a value that many in our community hold in high esteem, right? So over half the world's children grow up in bilingual or multilingual, I should say multilingual environments, not bilingual. Our country is not great at it. One thing, because I was talking too much with the teachers and I wanted to break it up, interestingly, the state that has the most dual language programs, the highest percentage, I shouldn't say most, and the most work going on is in Utah right now. So not necessarily if I did the quiz like I did with staff, I'm not sure everyone would have guessed Utah. A whole host of reasons for that for a different day. New Mexico's another one, which may be more predictable. Massachusetts, perhaps, in my opinion, because of question 2 or 3 in 2003, we're not that far along as a state. And Phyllis Hardy said that last time we were here, in terms of having multilingual or bilingual programs. And so we've got some catching up to do. We have more flexibility with the Look Act. We've exciting opportunities with the seal of biliteracy, which is more a secondary thing, but there's an equivalent elementary seal of biliteracy that is like a progress piece that's being developed. And Katie Richardson, who you met, who's our ELL coordinator, is working on that. And I think important to note that for me, dual language programs, it mattered that the report cited academic benefits for all, but particularly a positive impact on the achievement gap. As I'll talk about in a little bit, I've done a lot of research post your presentation, not yours, Phoebe, but your group's presentation. And one of the things that I continue to hear from everyone I speak to is the social emotional and then the interpersonal changes. I'll talk about that a little later. So I care about the achievement, but I also care about students' sense of belonging and how students interact over time cross-culturally. And I already talked about Mabe, so I'm not going to reference that. So this is a really hokey metaphor analogy. I always get those mixed up. I apologize. But I also have way too many words. This is like PowerPoint, worst case PowerPoint, right? Like it gets even worse as you go, right? There'll be like charts and tables in PowerPoint. So I thought an image might be helpful.
There's a name for this in business presentations. This is the cat photo.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
I guess I should figure out.
Break it up with happy cats.
Yeah. So this is not happy. It's it's happy because we have snow outside and it's lovely, but
It's happy enough.
It's happy enough. So why I selected this picture in addition to Mr. Demling's comments is what I'm proposing is a path to explore. I'm not making a formal proposal, and I'll get into that with timeline a little later. And so why I like this picture, however hokey my comments will be, is that it's the start of a path and you can't see exactly where it's going to end. So what I'm asking the school committee's endorsement of tonight is just that I continue to explore along this path, gather community input like I did with staff this afternoon, larger community input with more intentional and specific outreach to certain communities. I don't have something, there's more questions than answers in what I'm going to speak about, but it's not all questions, right? I want to be clear in that balance that I've taken in incredible work and incredible amounts of feedback on challenges our district's facing, and I have some real thoughts about a path to explore, but that exploration is not something I'm willing to commit to as we need to do this right now. For instance, I've never seen a dual language classroom. I've never sat in a dual language school, and I will, right? And we'll get into that in a little bit. I tend to not be, I read a lot, I've read your reports, I've talked to people, I value all those things, and I tend to be an experiential person where I need to see it, experience it, and be able to ask questions of people actually in the practice. So I'm going to talk about dual language and talk about special ed. I'm going to talk about responses to all the subgroups, but I want to just set the expectations, which is really a path to explore and a pathway to explore with a timeline, not necessarily, well, everything's mapped out and this is exactly what we should do, but I want to share my thoughts. So does that kind of make sense in terms of grain size? I'm going to pause if the committee has any questions before I dig into my thoughts.
I think we're good.
I think there's one.
No, sorry, there was one.
Just a
Yep,
brief
go ahead.
comment, I just really appreciate the way that you framed that. I mean, it's a really thoughtful way to approach what has been almost a year's, worth of community initial exploration of these ideas.
Yeah.
There could be the impetus to want to jump to the end, if you see possibilities, but I just really appreciate that patience.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. And all right, so here's some additional research that I said I did. So MSAN, for those of you who know, we're part of an MSAN, it's a network, Minority Student Achievement Network. The official name from their website, or the official description, is a national coalition of multiracial school districts that have come together to understand and eliminate opportunity achievement gaps persist in their schools. My language is, it's a group of suburban districts with higher than average diversity on multiple fronts, particularly race, ethnicity, than most suburban districts, who have a shared commitment and philosophy to be eliminating the opportunity achievement gaps. That's my framing. So I think what's valuable isn't just the philosophy being similar, but demographically, these districts are very similar to Amherst, and we struggle to find demographically similar districts in Massachusetts. So I did an analysis of all MSAN districts with elementary schools. There are some districts that are, especially in the Midwest, that are just secondary districts. And roughly half of the MSAN districts that have elementary schools, slightly below half, have dual language programs in them, which was really interesting to hear because when we go to MSAN conferences, this is not a topic that I've heard discussed. So here's a listing of the districts that have dual language programs. You can see how many they have based on the number of schools that are listed. It's important to note some districts, like Madison, Wisconsin, is huge compared to us. They have 30 some odd elementary schools. So a little later in the presentation, I'll talk about scale, but this is just on its face, the districts that have it. Where it says program type, for those of you who weren't with us for Phyllis Hardy's presentation, 50-50 involves that students are exposed to 50% of their day in one language, let's say in this case almost all Spanish, and 50% in English. 90-10 programs mean that their day is almost all in English, often save for specials and some other areas. So in terms of MSAN districts, almost all, the exception of Evanston, Skokie, have 50-50 models. Madison had had a range from 50-50 to 90-10, and they've actually, past few years, made a decision that 50-50 worked better, particularly because they were concerned about their monolingual Spanish speakers coming in and how much English they were getting. What they found is it was working great for the monolingual English kids to have that 90-10 model, and they found it wasn't working so well for the demographics. So when we think about achievement gap, it was just inconsistent with what their goals were. So they actually have now transitioned all to 50-50 programs. I've spoken directly, and Debbie helped me with a couple, but then I followed up with a staff person in all of these districts. And I think I mentioned in a previous meeting, it's hard to get them off the phone, which is a wonderful problem to have. There's a listing of what I could find of Massachusetts districts with dual language programs. What you'll see here is that demographically, these are often not as good a match for our community. Cambridge is the most analogous, although it's a good match, it's not a great match. Demographically, they have a higher rate of ELL students than we do, and Spanish-speaking ELL students than we do. And you can see there's more likelihood in Massachusetts for programs to be 90-10 or 80-20, which is a version of, very similar to the 90-10 model. A lower percentage of 50-50 models in Massachusetts. So just to summarize what I've already stated, compared to their counterparts in Massachusetts, the MSAN schools, they're much more similar to our community, both philosophically but also demographically. And Cambridge is the best comp in Massachusetts. And it's no disrespect to your group that went to Holyoke. I know there was a lot of great learning there. I was just trying to find districts that are more
Right,
similar to
yeah,
ours. It's not
absolutely.
that there was a bad experience. I just want to put that disclaimer out. So when I thought about this, and I'm starting with dual language, and I'm going to talk about special ed. I'm going to talk about declining enrollment. So I'll be talking about all of them. I just decided to start with dual language. All the different subgroup reports and my response. So I really thought about how would one make a decision about what language would be the partner language. And so I thought about, well, the first thing we want to think about is who are we serving? And about half of our ELL students speak Spanish as their primary or their first language. And all the other languages, I put the Chinese and Korean were second and third, but significant gap between Spanish and those. The number of Latino students, as I already mentioned, based on the enrollment working group report, has increased. Spanish is a really common language in our region of Massachusetts, our region of New England. And we have a fair number of bilingual staff members, right? Because everything can look great, and if you don't have staff members who can teach in whatever the partner language is, you're not going to have a program. And with working with our human resources department, we did an analysis of staff, and it's the difference even with our students is much greater with our faculty. We have a fair number of bilingual Spanish-speaking faculty. We don't have anywhere close to that in any other language. And so based on those objective criteria, for me, if we're going to go down the exploring road, Spanish would be the preferred partner language if we wanted to explore a dual language program. Similarly, I did an analysis on what would be a location. What are objective criteria that could be used to think about a location for such a program to be explored. So the first one was, if we're really serious about choice and no one being forced into it, well, the only way I can think about that is if we're having two sections of that involved in a program, we need 3 classes per grade level. So you need at least one monolingual class in each grade level. So the school would have to be large enough to have 3 classes, two for the dual language piece and 1 monolingual. As I said, we want to avoid displacing current students or even future students based on their disability. I should say current and future, really more future. And in my conversations with Ms. Hardy, as well as other districts expressed that lots of students with disabilities can participate. Social emotional disabilities is actually, some districts are reporting there's a benefit to dual language programs within their demographic groups. The one group that sort of everyone has shared with me would struggle is students with pretty significant either intellectual disabilities or multiple disabilities around communication. And those are typically the students in our intensive learning center at Wildwood, that it wouldn't be an appropriate placement given the students' learning challenges. We'd want to have the least disruption of staffing across the buildings. There would certainly be some if we're going to do this and do it well, but try to reduce that. As the declining enrollment work, so a lot of these are going to start merging together. I'm going to be citing things from different subgroups because that's, I think, how it should work. The enrollment patterns of each school, trying to target the school with the sharpest decline. I showed that graph before that the enrollment working group displayed, right, it wasn't equal in terms of where the decline was. We'd want to explore whether a program could balance the socioeconomic diversity across our 3 schools. So one of the other enrollment working groups talking about that, could that be done in a way that included choice? And there's some logistics to having a centralized location if we're going to involve some revised busing model. Being in the middle makes sense. So based on those objective criteria for me, if we're going to explore this, Fort River would be the logical place for that exploration to occur. I want to be super clear about the next point, though, the bottom point, which I know is in small font. This is not an attempt to suggest that the infrastructure of Fort River School does not need attention and work. That's why Mr. Nakajima and I and others are on a school building committee. That's why we have capital improvements in this year's budget for Fort River, as well as the next couple years for Fort River. So the infrastructure of the school had nothing to do with kind of location criteria, and it's not a non-infrastructure way to try to solve an infrastructure problem. The infrastructure problem exists. I know sometimes it could be viewed that, oh, well, this is because the infrastructure, and for me, those are two very different things. And talk about budget, we can talk about capital tonight and talk about Fort River. But I want to just really disentangle those two that one might logically tangle. Why start at one school and one grade level? So Phyllis Hardy answered a lot of these questions, but I know not everyone saw her. So, MABE was very clear on the recommendation of one grade level, one school. Their recommended timeline, which Ms. Hardy gave to me, suggests we're on schedule if we were thinking of a fall 2019 start. We'll talk about timeline at the end, but we're, according to Ms. Hardy, right where we would need to be, right where other districts are, which is kind of exciting. We might be able to partner with some other districts in Massachusetts who are exploring this on the same timeline as us, which I think the inter-district collaboration could bear a lot of positive results. So in our analysis, we currently have 4 to 5 classroom teachers, 2 to 3 special education teachers, 2 to 3 counselors. Actually, that's 3 counselors. Got confirmation of that this afternoon, who are bilingual, English and Spanish. And I think to the point of bilingual, all these people we're citing, particularly the classroom teachers and counselors, are either native Spanish speakers or have taught in a Spanish-speaking country, so taught in Spanish before, or have taught. We have 1 or 2 teachers who have taught in dual language programs before in Spanish. So I think there's one thing to feel like you're comfortable and competent in Spanish, a really different thing to talk about being able to teach in Spanish. So I want to clarify that point, which is wonderful that we have those resources, and it's not a critical mass where we can be doing this in multiple buildings really quickly. And I have questions about our capacity, implementation-wise, to do that well. So here's another table, sorry. So I compared ourselves to the 4 similarly sized MSAN districts with dual language programs. By similarly sized, less than 10 elementary schools, less than 5,000 elementary school students. So Princeton, Verona, LaGrange, Harrisonburg. You'll notice that Harrisonburg has a link to it, like the color's different. If you're on the presentation, which you have digitally, you click, there's a fantastic report about Harrisonburg. They did a lot of work. They did work about early childhood education. So they had an increasing college community, just where James Madison University is, about 2 hours west of Washington, D.C. And there's about a 30-page outside report about what they've done that is inclusive of their work on dual language, but that's like 8 pages of the 28-page report. They totally revamped early childhood education in the community because what they were finding is what we're finding. We have a changing demographic. Much higher percentage, increasing percentage of families who speak language other than English at home, higher increasing rate of Latino students. And so it's really nice to have a case study in a district that also shares values and shares an academic community like we have. So the third column is the number of dual language programs. So you see we have 3 elementary schools. We don't currently have one. Princeton has 1. It started 4 years ago. Verona has 1. It started a little further ago, and LaGrange also started a while ago. Harrisonburg has 5 of their 6 schools have dual language programs, and the shocking thing is that their first one started in 2010. So, to use a layman term, they're like a unicorn, right? Everything everyone has told me and other districts' experience doesn't match with what they've done. So I've actually spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks talking to multiple principal, ELL director, in Harrisonburg about their approach. And the nice thing is it's written up, and the document's now 2 years old, so I think at that point they had 4 or 5 because they opened a new elementary school. So, and the other neat thing about Harrisonburg is that they started basically every other year. So you have like students who are in middle school now, and then you have schools that started this year with their first program. So really fascinating conversations in Harrisonburg. The next column shows whether they did neighborhood zoning only or hybrid. By hybrid, I mean they had neighborhood zoning plus some lottery system. So in Princeton, it's neighborhood zoning only. 2 out of the 3 classes are the bilingual. They've only needed to do the lottery once, and by lottery there, what I'm referring to is lottery within the community park, that's the school there, within that school population, who gets into the dual language program. It's 3 of the 4 years it's worked out perfectly, where 2/3 wanted it, 1/3 didn't. One year they had more families that wanted it than they, it didn't work, the numbers didn't work out. So they prioritized Spanish-speaking ELL students to have more Spanish language models in the classrooms. In Verona, they do a neighborhood hybrid, so they have neighborhood school zoning, which is the majority, and they have a lottery, and their lottery has preference for siblings and for students of staff members, and they provide transportation. In LaGrange, it's neighborhood zoning only. Harrisonburg, now this is sort of shifting. When they started, they had a hybrid, which was neighborhood zoning plus a lottery. They didn't provide transportation. They just couldn't do it financially. And first language was a factor, so they did prioritize if you were Spanish-speaking that you had more access. At this point, it's in 5 of the 6 schools. There's only 1 school without any of the programs, so the lottery doesn't work. And what actually happened there is, they started with 1, and then when they got to 3 out of 5, they sort of divided the town, and so that there was like lottery zones, and but it keeps shifting because they've opened so many schools. But the report is really worth reading. It talks about their partnership with James Madison University about how do you find all these teachers who are bilingual. It's also interesting learning from them because they've expanded so quickly. Things haven't gone perfectly, right? The report presents a wonderful and accurate picture, and what they're able to share with me is they wish they'd done a lot more work on publicly sharing the work around special needs students' access to the programs, right? So it wasn't omitted, it just was part of the package, and what they would do differently is really reach out to kind of special education parents and gather feedback along the way. And now they've been able to even out the percentages of special education students in their programs and not in in the dual language classrooms and not, but that wasn't the case when they started. So with all these districts, there's a lot of lessons learned, and I'm just appreciative that we have places to call that'll talk to me and tell me this went well, and oh my God, don't do this. This was, which people are very open about. And the last category just shows that all the schools have 2 bilingual classes per grade level, and then they base on the school side how many monolingual classes they have. So for us, I'd be thinking about 2 dual language classes in a grade level. I think it's an open question about neighborhood zoning only, or some hybrid system where we include a lottery for in this case, Fort River students. If we did, some of the factors that I think are worth exploring are socioeconomic balance. We had a very clear report from an enrollment working group that's critical, and this perhaps is a way to have families' choice in and not have to mix up kids in a way that's not by choice, not have parents with 1 child in 1 school. Oh, the redistricting happened now that other child's in a different school, but really only would be for families who choose. Preschool access, I'll be very candid as I was with staff this afternoon that I think if we can find a way to find space at Crocker Farm, that's a much preferable answer, and I'll get into this in a bit, to how to pay for it's a different one, but where to add a preschool class than adding one at Fort River and Wildwood. Again, I'll get to that in a little bit, but if we reduced, Crocker Farm is always between 2 and 3 classes. If some Crocker Farm students were part of the lottery and could stay, we have a couple years where there's 2s, that might open up space for an additional preschool class to be in the same school where the preschool coordinator is, the other staff members, related service providers who specialize in working with 3 to 5-year-olds, which is very different than those of us who worked with upper elementary kids. And should we consider the fiscal? We have to maintain 8 classes at grade level. We can't be adding sections to Fort River and adding sections to all of our schools. Just fiscally, we can't do it, as I said earlier. And linguistic cultural background, whereas Princeton really took that into account. We heard Phyllis Hardy talk about having Spanish language models is really important in a community like Amherst. So I don't have a solution to this. I'm not pretending to present one. These are just the types of things I think about the more I think about the recommendations from multiple subgroups, as well as what I hear from other communities. So in terms of declining enrollment, and I think this is a really important point, and Mr. Shea and Mr. Yaffe feel really strongly about this. They spoke about it with staff this afternoon. If this is going to be explored, I think it's also an opportunity to think about what can be explored at Crocker Farm and Wildwood to enhance the experience and really focus those schools on, theming, as I said to staff, it's not like Disney World theming. That's not at all where I'm going. But really having a distinct focus. We're still going to be teaching the same math curriculum across all of our schools. It's not that there won't be things in commonality, but can there be a little more intentionality? The example I use, this is my 17th year working in some capacity in the Amherst Public Schools, whether it's teacher, principal, or central office. And the thing that the conversation always goes, it's a binary conversation in some ways. Either our schools are too much like each other, we're trying to force them to be too similar, or they're like their own districts. And so I actually think there's an opportunity here for, separate from anything to do with dual language, to get that right. To really have each school have a unique identity, and that's the word I'm using, identity, that's developed through a community engagement and staff engagement process at all three of the schools. And it's not that Fort Rivers would only be dual language. I mean, that'll, as I said to staff, if this all played out, it would be 2026 before every grade level has a dual language set of classrooms at Fort River, every grade level have that. So really it's how do we promote an identity for each school? How do we have each school community feel a part of that and feel like they have ownership of how that happens at their school? Because no one is interested in Fort River or Wildwood feeling quote unquote left behind. But how do we enhance that experience and give the right amount of flexibility for schools to maintain that? And that's sort of where education, better or worse, is going, that people want to have that identity. They want to have that connection. And I think our schools do a wonderful job creating it without that level of flexibility. But I know that Mr. Yaffe and Mr. Shea have lots of ideas and lots of thoughts, both on the process and the content of how they might approach that task and what might result of it. And each school has a little bit of that, right? Naturally, that happens in every district with every elementary school, but actually, how do we not have it sort of haphazardly or because X person's at X place at X time, but very intentionally? I believe that'll make each school more attractive to families looking at other options they have. One of the main pieces of feedback from the declining enrollment group was that unique programming was a major consideration. And how do we not have to have the exact same staffing in every single area at our elementary schools? Could schools have more distinct focuses on certain areas around it? So I don't have the answer of what that looks like, but what I do know is I think it's a process that would be beneficial for us to enter into. And lastly, there was significant feedback from the dual language family survey. So I'm crossing enrollment working groups here, subgroups here, that more students perhaps would stay in district if we did have dual language programming as well. So socioeconomic balance I already spoke to a bit, but if SES is considered as a major factor in a dual language lottery system, it's actually a sort of logistically, and I don't want to sound, control's not the word I'm aiming to use, but it allows us as a district, based on choices families want to make for their children, to really be able to manage the disparities between our schools, because we could set the enrollment of who gets into which program, and if there is a lottery. Whether we want to do that or not, I think that's something that needs a lot more discussion, but the potential to balance SES without having anyone redistricted is really attractive. Having been through a process as a principal at Crocker Farm that balanced SES, which I think was the right thing to do. It's important. I believe in the subgroups work, but did it through a massive redistricting. If there's a less massive way to do that and to do it gradually over time instead of all one full swoop, I think it's worth exploring. Special education. So one of the pieces, and this resonated a lot with staff from all of our schools, a data point that was in the report from the enrollment working group was that the disparity of special education percentages across our three schools, Fort River being 26%, Wildwood being 19%, and Crocker Farm being 17%. So I want to just take a step back and actually note that that's a significant part of that is based on the specialized programs in each school that draw students across. I also want to note that Crocker Farm has an incredibly diverse demographic right now. They have the highest ELL percentage across our schools. So one could logically read these slides and come to the conclusion that that's not true, and it's absolutely true that Crocker Farm is an incredibly wonderfully rich, diverse community, and I don't want to be perceived as anything such, as anything different. So I'm not interested, I agree with the enrollment working group, changing programs of students when they are well equipped and well supported in their programs is not something that I'd be interested in doing. In other words, pulling kids out of a specialized program or moving students to a different school and specialized program, right? Those are things that we have a lot of evidence and data from families that yeah, it'd be great to live in, go to school in the catchment area I live in, but I'm really happy with my school, right? And so we want to balance that, the nuance that they cited. However, and this is one of these 3 a.m. moments where you start seeing connections between 5 diverse groups. In the spring of 2019, or I guess the fall, well, the spring they graduate, more than half the building blocks population graduates elementary school by just an odd quirk of, it's just an odd quirk of coincidence. And so it gives us an opportunity to think a little differently. Now, there's other students in the queue. I mean, the program's pretty full as it is. 17's pretty close to where we feel like we have 2 classrooms for building block students. So it gives us an opportunity to reset some of where building blocks is without having to move students. So one thing that I'd like to explore, and I have shared this with the Special Ed Parent Advisory Group, the CPAC president, and we have some engagement that you'll see later on this, is could we maintain that one class of building blocks with 8 students remaining in it, which is about the average size of a building blocks cohort, and then for the second cohort, and there are students in the queue for this, have it move to another school. So it doesn't disadvantage any student by forcing them to change schools unless they so choose to. And some may, right? I can imagine a family saying, my building block support can be in my catchment area. Awesome, I'm in, right? Like, I loved Fort River, but great, it's at Crocker Farm or Wildwood, and that's across the street from where I live. So we don't want to preclude that option, but we wouldn't force that option either. So some of the benefits would be that it would even out some of the percentages around special education. It also doesn't preclude building block students from participating in a dual language program if that happens at Fort River, because we'd still have that same flexibility. And again, everything I've heard from multiple districts is if families are interested, it would be fully supported. The students could be fully supported within that program. Why building blocks and other programs? I mean, there is this coincidental year where we have a lot of graduates, but also building blocks is the program far and away where students make mid-career changes. So for most of our students, the vast majority of our students in the ILC program, Intensive Learning Center programs at Wildwood, they start in kindergarten if they were Amherst residents in kindergarten, and they have their whole career through that school. Building blocks, it's rare that we have a student start in kindergarten because it's typical, it's very atypical. So most often students are transitioning in grades 1 through 6 mid-career. And so if we can reduce the number of students who have to have that mid-career change, it doesn't totally solve all the challenges that were cited in the report, but I think it makes the most logical and feasible next step. So preschool access, we just heard excellent report. I'm interested in figuring out how over time we can create space at Crocker Farm for that. I was at when I started at Fort River, the construction at the preschool was happening for Crocker Farm. The quads were not, and someone will rightfully critique me for saying this, they're not a great setup for any age student, but they're really not a great setup for 3 to 5-year-olds. Asking 3 to 5-year-olds to watch the volume of their voice, right? I have a 4-year-old, I'm woefully inadequate at that. And just in terms of the where they'd be located in a school, who would be managing that piece without a preschool coordinator there, all those pieces make me, if that's the only thing we can do 2 years from now or next year and we have the funding, wonderful. But if we can figure out a way to do it at Crocker Farm by shifting some enrollments, I'd be really excited. And I think the other piece, not just a coordinator, all due respect to Michelle, but the collaboration. Having 5 other classroom teachers to be able to collaborate with on a preschool level, it's really hard to be the only anything in a big building, right? I mean, it's hard to be the principal, right? And that's one of the things I appreciate is our principals talk to each other all the time because there's no other principal, there's no other person exactly in that role. To be the only preschool teacher in a school and having a principal take that on, and I think it's not an ideal option. And this has at least the potential, if we do a lottery, to make some headway into creating space. And frankly, they need more space right now, independent of another classroom. And Michelle would agree with me on that. So budgeting, this is, and Phyllis has sent me a lot of stuff as well as talking to other districts, that dual language program is the most cost-conscious way to have world language programming because you're not necessarily needing to add staff. It's just redefining roles on staff or hiring when vacancies emerge. There are some curriculum costs, 1 grade level at a time, but that gets absorbed gradually over time. So we do have a curriculum budget, so it would have to reprioritize some things, but we think it's feasible. If the facilities or infrastructure changes, and I'm not going to go into possible changes because There's a lot of things that could happen in the next 10, 15 years about infrastructure. Really what we need is 14 classrooms in the same space. So I feel like it's durable that way. And other than the preschool seats, we feel like it would be cost neutral. And if we had a limited lottery, one can imagine a 2-stop run. So let's say there was a lottery and students lived in Crocker Farm, they could take the bus to Crocker Farm and then take a van over to Fort River. We do that for other students as well. It means a longer transportation ride, but the group that studied this said that parents were willing to have a longer bus ride, or many parents were willing to do that. That was a trade-off that was worth it for them.
I would say just there, that's listed, there's a whole data section that could be analyzed further about that.
Yeah.
That could be helpful as we look at that further.
Yeah, maybe we'll look for a newly crowned community volunteer to help us with sorry.
Yep.
And so, here's the question a lot of people are wondering, what about current students? And I think the challenge we have is the fiscal climate we're in, and the ability to add staff is a real challenge when we're not able to hold on to everything we want to hold on to as it is. Talking to some other districts, they have worked with after-school providers. Funding and staffing would have to be a challenge, but LSSC and other school providers perhaps would be interested in this possibility. If it's fee-based, it could perhaps be cost neutral. I'd love to think of larger ways to integrate in the school day, but in a cost-neutral way, I guess I'm struggling to find that out. If our financial situation changes sometime in the future, I'd be really open to thinking about other ways to think about this. And I said this in the earlier meeting, every dual language school I spoke to, and they all have bilingual classes, monolingual classes. There's also ways to infuse the culture. No matter, one of the people I spoke to said, you could go to our monolingual class, they never speak a word of Spanish, and yet the cultural piece comes through really in a very similar way to the bilingual, the dual language classes. And so thinking about what are ways in our schools, in our community, that we can enhance the profile of Spanish-speaking people, Spanish-speaking cultures. So even if language isn't necessarily spoken in those classrooms, that all of our students get exposure and a welcome feeling, and are supported in that. So I know that's not the same as having world language instruction during the elementary school day, but I'm looking forward, I think my next slide or the slide after, will have some information about some future explorations I'm doing where I hope to learn more. Yeah, it is. And I'm almost done. I know it's been lengthy, but so I just had a couple of the dates of the enrollment working group. Sorry, that should say 314. Sorry, preschool subgroup. That was today because of the snow. Mabe was here last time. So I presented this with faculty, staff, to school committee. We were supposed to do an Amherst media taping of exactly this presentation, probably in a condensed format. We got snowed out yesterday because they shut down operations. Maybe it's going to be Friday afternoon. I still have to work out that. But we want to have that on Amherst media as well. Next week, which is weird that it's next week. It's just snow on the ground. March 23rd, I'm thinking spring and, sorry. I really don't like winter right now. And so, I know, I'm tired. I woke up pretty early this morning. Yeah.
Can we get that green picture back just for a moment?
Exactly. Yeah. 4:45 this morning. I didn't have the green. I should have, right? That's what Mr. Demling was saying. So next week, Mr. Donez, Ms. Chamberlain, and I are going to visit the Cambridge Amigo School. It started, I think I referenced, in the 1980s, so it's a really mature program they have there. It's a Spanish-English dual-language program, school, 50-50 program. And that's through Mabe, so there's other visitors there as well. So we're looking forward to that. The following day, our curriculum coordinator, Mr. Sheehan, who's here tonight, and our ELL coordinator, Ms. Richardson, they're invited to a Mabe Symposium on dual language programs for ELLs. So they're going to attend that, which is somewhere in the Boston area. The following Monday, I'm going to travel with Dr. Brady, who's here tonight, and Ms. Greenfield, who you met, who works on co-teaching and has been leading our efforts on dual needs students. And we're going to visit the dual language school in Princeton, New Jersey, which has incredibly similar demographics that we have, and having a lens. And we actually have lined up some time with someone who works in special education at that school, as well as other items that day, but having a very intentional focus on special needs. We have a planned informational meetings for families. It's April 4th, and we're going to advertise in the bulletin because our target audience is preschool families. So we're going to send it out to all the preschools. We finished the flyer today to gather their feedback and input, and we're going to do that at the Jones Library because we thought if you're a preschool family and you haven't been to our schools, you probably have been to the Jones Library, or many families. It's also on the bus line. It's really accessible. And I'm going to do that with Phyllis Hardy. So she's going to come and do that with me, and she's bilingual, so we will be able to have support for families. We also are planning, and we don't have a date for this yet, an informational meeting specifically for Spanish-speaking families. We imagine they'll have very different questions, or many different questions, than monolingual English-speaking families about the program. So we also are planning with CPAC to have meetings both in April and the fall, and the CPAC wouldn't just be on the dual language, also on the building blocks and some of the other aspects, but the CPAC president has been updated and fully supportive of the exploration of the items that we were discussing. Mabe will be back this spring. They're actually going to spend, Phyllis is going to spend the whole day here on the 4th because she's going to be here in the morning and the afternoon, so she's going to work with myself, Mr. Sheehan, Mr. Chamberlain, and some interested staff members. So we're going to send all these this PowerPoint and all the other ones out to faculty and ask who would like to participate in some of the work that day. I'd like to continue to update you every meeting and the community every meeting we're here. La Siembra, if you remember last time, was the kind of roughly 10-person group that would meet for 2 full days to really get into the nitty-gritty of what this program might look like on the dual language front. It includes staff, administration, parents, and guardians. Framingham's another district that's doing some exploration, and we're seeing if it's possible to align our dates so we can both save funding, because it'll be less expensive, but more importantly, frankly, be working with another district and sharing our context and their context. And I think there'd be some rich dialogue that could occur if we're going to do it one way or the other, but we're hoping to do it with Framingham together. I'm going to visit, I don't know who's going to come with me yet, but in Harrisonburg, Virginia, because that was the one I referenced earlier. So I'm really interested, not just because of what I shared earlier, but I'm going to be seeing 2 schools 3/4 of the way through the school year. I'm really interested. Harrisonburg Southern schools start a little earlier than us. I think it's the beginning of the 4th week of their school year. So that's a really different, seeing kindergarten in the 4th week in an English classroom only is really different than seeing it in March. So I'm particularly interested to see the range of what does it look like in Cambridge, a really mature program. What does it look like in Princeton, 4th year? And what does it look like in Harrisonburg? And that day they've already, I'm going to see the newest of their programs, the oldest of their programs, and be able to see multiple sites that day, but also be able to see them 4 weeks into the school year. And what I would plan to do is at some point I'm thinking perhaps late September, early October is my thought, perhaps the latter, is to come with a full proposal for your consideration and then really have some forums in the community once I've gathered feedback, as I've gathered feedback along the way and educated myself along the way, and really come back to you with a full proposal for your consideration in the fall. So I wouldn't be looking for anything that looks like a vote or a decision until kind of mid-fall. I think we would need it by mid-fall for us to do the planning to be successful hereafter. So I do see a timeline of sometime in October in my head. I think once, according to Mabe on the dual language piece, and I think many of the other aspects as well, I think once we go beyond that timeline, then it becomes not feasible to implement the following year. And if that's the way it goes, that's the way it goes. But I think I'm trying to backwards design, how can I design a process that at least it's possible that fall of 19 occurs for some of these changes. And that gets us going backwards. October of this calendar year is probably when we need to be at a decision. I think there's some things, when I say decision, some things can be like, yes, we're doing X, we need more information to do Y. I wouldn't expect that we have preschool, for instance, completely sorted out by next October in terms of space and funding, because that'd be before the budget cycle. And but I think having a proposal of some functional items by October that could be considered community forums and then voted in the fall would give us enough time to implement the following academic year. Oh, sorry, this is my last slide, I promise. Some other feedback we've gotten, and from staff and community members, as this has been talked about just over the last couple months with the Enrollment Working Group, can we have some Spanish language classes for staff? Not necessarily to receive fluency, to achieve fluency, but to achieve a conversational level that allows folks more access and participation if we're going to go down this route. University programs and partnerships, we need to work with who's training our teachers. We can't assume that they will come to us. And that links to the last point, which is the recruitment of bilingual staff, which we do anyway, but we're taking that up a notch even this spring. And as I said to staff, our worst case, like say none of this happens and we have more bilingual staff, that's a great problem to have. So while it's somewhat geared to this proposal, it's actually a broader attempt that we've talked about many times at school committee around diversifying our faculty. We have to identify the future staffing of programs and shifts between schools, so HR is heavily involved in this, and continued work with MABE, particularly they have a dual language special education network, and joining that network and continuing our education around how special education would work in a dual language program. That's really the last slide. So again, I apologize for the length. I think if I went any quicker.
You adequately prepared us for the length
Yeah.
it's coming, so
Yeah.
we're right on schedule.
Okay.
What we anticipated, so thank you. That's really great presentation. So I'm going to now open it to the school committee for responses and questions, thoughts, and then I'm just remind everybody they'll also have an opportunity for the public to weigh in as well. Yeah, Mr. Demling.
So thank you for that. So I guess the two high-level perspectives I had as you were presenting that were that you had to respond to a lot of really in-depth explorations of a lot of difficult challenges, particularly in the budget-constrained environment that we're working in. And so I'm always thinking practically of not just the budget-constrained, but not making the perfect the enemy of the good, you know, of wanting to throw everything out if every little thing isn't. So that being said, I think you did a really good job in terms of illustrating what that nice green slide was representing, the path to explore further. I had a lot of specific questions that you answered 80% of as you went along, so I think you did a good job of going to that detailed level.
Thank you.
You know, without going through everything, you know, I'm pretty excited about a lot of the ideas you talked about, dual language in particular, for the striking achievement gap impact that it has, and the social emotional impact. Just, you know, I won't belabor that point. It's been said very well before. One of the main practical challenges that I sort of kept coming back to, that would be one of the things I think we would want to do a really deep dive in terms of best practices, is this idea of control of the lottery, particularly when it comes to socioeconomic balance. I can imagine, just off the top of my head, some difficult scenarios in which we might have a program that is too heavily weighted to with students that are economically disadvantaged, and so favoring those who are economically advantaged into a program that everybody wants to get into, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so just that kind of issue, I think would benefit from a lot of community engagement and feedback and iterations of that. That being said, I really love the approach you took in terms of the MCN districts and the lessons learned. Like, it just made me like this is why I love public education so much. Like, there's the fact that this grand experiment is happening in thousands and thousands of places all across the country that we can then draw on what others have done is just beautiful. So I really appreciate that. And I guess the question I had, you didn't really touch on it after it was mentioned, was this idea of themes at Crocker and Wildwood, and that you had maybe some initial discussions with Mr. Yaffe, Mr. Shea. I just wanted to sink my teeth a little bit more into that, but maybe Mr. Shea, if they wanted to maybe comment, and also about timeline. Is this something that if they were into it, if the community was into it, you would also think about exploring this fall, or is that a longer term?
So, Mr. Shea, do you want to speak to the first point? You don't have to. I'm answer it, but.
I'll let you start, and then I'll think of them.
Okay. So I'll do the timeline piece. So I do think it makes sense to align the explorations, because if we're exploring Fort River, for instance, the dual language piece at Fort River, for each school to be engaged in self-study. I think the irony is that, you know, Crocker Farm and Wildwood, perhaps, some of the changes, and not that Fort River wouldn't be involved in that. Again, dual language will start hypothetically, if all this works out and I recommend it and it's supported by the community, as well as yourselves, and one grade level in fall of 2019, right? There's going to be a whole lot of other grade levels at Fort River, right, the majority, who are unaffected by it. So really it's trying to to think of all three schools, to be doing that self-study and getting community feedback and really helping go in a direction. So I wouldn't think that we would wait for the decision in the fall to then think about what to do. I mean, I know Mr. Shea and Mr. Yaffe were excited by the idea. It came from them, frankly, right away when we were first talking about this kind of general concept. And I don't think there's necessarily like a waiting piece that needs to occur to sort of get started with what would this look like from a process perspective? How would we engage students, faculty, and the community to think about those things? And we've got 3 permanent principals in our elementary schools who are looking to be here for a long time. And how do we access that to kind of help set some identity for the school? And some of that already exists, right? I mean, we don't have Stepford schools. If you go into our schools, separate from the infrastructure, there's a different feel to them, right? And it's not unintentional, right? It's not like it just happens to be that way. There's a lot of sharing of resources, but Mr. Yaffe just walked in as well. We're just talking a little bit about the exploration that perhaps would occur at Crocker Farm and at Wildwood.
I'll just mention, it's a really good question, Peter. So take today, for example, March 14th. One of the things we were talking about at school today was this idea of some sort of, perhaps, for want of a better term, social justice curriculum that perhaps we decide we want to develop, right, or create or implement or whatever order that goes in. One of the things we were talking about in school today, for example, was we don't want Crocker Farm, for example, to be a place where people they receive an experience in one particular class with one particular teacher and they're excited about that, but they don't ever receive that experience again, right? Or they're just really itching to have that teacher because this is the one thing that they really like to make sure they get. We want to make sure that across the school we have some things in place that we think everyone's going to benefit from. So here's an example. Let's say, student-led conferences. That's a good one to pick. So we've got a number of teachers in our school right now who are experimenting with the idea of having student-led conferences. So essentially, just what it is, students take charge of the conference. We've started
parent conference.
Parent conferences, sorry. So we started to talk about that a little bit in terms of, okay, do we want that to become part of the norm of who we are? So I use that just as a sort of really small example because I do think that this possibility that Dr. Morris is talking about, I think opens up other possibilities, for example, at Crocker, where we say we may want to decide to become, and it could be bigger than that, it could be something much bigger. But we're thinking, and I've made some contacts with some people today who I know are in the fields and asked them to come and meet, and much like Mike's heading off in this train for, well, I'm not going to Virginia, but certainly I'm not going to fall asleep at the wheel. You know what I mean? That's for sure.
Mr. Yaffe, would you like to say anything? No? Okay.
Project-based learning. Yeah, so I think actually it's a great timing for this in terms of where we're at in each of the schools. That we've worked hard over the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years to build something that means a lot to our staff and to our communities. And at the same time, I think, as Derek's saying, we could go deeper. We could really seize the moment at Crocker Farm, at Wildwood, and at Fort River. And there will be things that we're saying this is part of the core Amherst experience. But there's going to be a real, what I would hope that will generate, what Derek's talking about, is that we'll generate among our staff, like, okay, what kind of school do we want to create here? How do we envision Wildwood to be 5 years from now? How do we envision Crocker Farm? What identity can we create? And I think with Mike at the helm and all of you supporting that, it's going to be really exciting. This is exciting, the dual language idea, but there are many other things that we've started to explore in our schools, whether it's the student-led conferences, project-based learning, real-world connections, inquiry, co-teaching, that with our staff saying, okay, how do you create a school vision, a mission, and what things, as Derek's saying, is this really a part of what we're doing here at Crocker Farm or at Wildwood? Do you really believe in this? And so I think people will feel that palpable sense of teachers embracing that. and thinking big, because this is pretty big. You know, I think, Mike, you know, I think this whole idea can then be done at the other schools in a way, you know, where you're thinking big, thinking out of the box. And I just feel like it's the right time in Amherst. We've held on to integrated arts. We've started to look at project-based learning, student ownership of their own learning. And now we can just say, yeah, let's do it. So,
Nice.
those are
Well,
my thoughts, Derek. What do you think?
well, I just want to, I just want to say thank you. It's really great to hear both of your just, you know, initial sort of take and perspective on this. I think from sort of what the conversations that we've been in around, you know, just in this climate where there are so many more choices around education and where people are choosing to send their kids. And, you know, it's not just, oh, I automatically send my kid to the public school. It starts to become, you know, maybe more, oh, you know, how do we kind of, you know, sell our schools? How do we let people know what's so great about our schools? And so in that, like, you know, there's sort of that risk of wanting to kind of slap on, oh, well, this is this school and this is that school. And you know, of course, when you go down that path, you start to risk, you know, not having it be an authentic process of going through that. And I think that what you're speaking to is that this is already sort of an energy that's there, and that this really has the potential to be a really deep and authentic process that, I mean, I think, you know, what is the value of a theme? What does that do for education? Is that beyond sort of what our school looks like? What does that really do, you know, educationally, pedagogically, for how we you know, bring this to our students? And so I think that's exciting to hear, and I think it's potentially as exciting as this, you know, to hear how those other how all the schools might engage in this kind of conversation. So I think that's, you know, I was noting that's not a piece that I was so focused on the dual immersion, I wasn't thinking about that, and now I think that opens a whole world of sort of where our district could possibly be going on that path.
And the one thing I would just add is that the trick that we would like to really find in the next year or so is that I certainly, in the time I've been at Crocker Farm, have spent a number of hours speaking with a limited number of families from our community about such matters. And one of the things we want to really strive for is to make sure that, and I was talking with Dr. Guevara about this last week, is we truly want to make sure that we talk with everyone and we hear from everyone. So we're going to have to find a way to do that, because it's fine to hear voices who certainly someone like myself speak to on a regular basis, but we want to make sure we reach everyone and people who represent a very large entire cross-section of our community. So that's something we're going to be working terribly hard on in next year.
Thank you. You wanna, yeah.
Yeah, so you know, I think this is, it is extremely exciting. I also just want to echo the principal's statements about making sure that we are hearing from as many different voices as possible, because I think as exciting as it is, you know, changes like this can also be scary, quite frankly, for families if they don't understand exactly why something is being proposed, or, you know, how that's going to impact their kids or anything like that. So, and I think especially when we start to examine or explore ideas around specializing or themes, you know, people start to get uncertain and unease, right? You know, is this going to impact my children when they go to, you know, later on for, you know, later educational choices, et cetera. So I'm heartened to hear that people are thinking about it and talking about it in that way, and that they're asking those questions out loud, because I think they're important. So I have two very quick comments, and then two sort of big questions. Sure. And should I just go ahead?
I think just go ahead.
Okay. So quickly, the comments, I think, you know, the idea of the lottery with a preference for siblings, I find personally extremely valuable. I think having the opportunity for families both to stay together in that educational environment, but also speaking as a bilingual person, I think having that ability to be able to practice with another person at home, especially if your parents are monolingual and cannot communicate, or your caregivers are monolingual and cannot communicate in that language that you're learning, that is incredibly important for retention and facility with the language. And so I think thinking about it from that perspective, about the benefits that would bring, if you can maintain the, you know, the family unit together to a certain degree, is incredibly important. The other thing that I was going to say is just in terms of the last, second to last slide that you shared, the process to explore, I think sharing that timeline with the community, and finding ways to, make sure that if there's milestones that are coming up in that timeline, that those opportunities are shared with the school committee and with the PGOs, extremely important, so that people can show up, right? Because even though we're talking about the forums in the fall, as being sort of a key moment for the community to lock in and pay attention to what's happening, we really want that happening way before, right? And so I think, it's like the flyer that you mentioned that's being prepared for the April 4th event, if that can be shared with the school committee and shared with the PGOs, we can share it among our social networks and make sure that it gets out. I think it's critically important. So my questions. The one big question that I have, the first question that I have is related to the slide, the area around the impact that this might have on socioeconomic balance. I think I followed you throughout the entire thing, right? I'm right there with you, completely get what you're talking about. You lost me on that piece. It's less clear to me the connection between, this possibility and how that would benefit socioeconomic balance in, among our school population. So if you can just walk me and us through that a little bit more, that would be helpful. And then the last thing that I was going to ask, and this is, probably, I'm sure you've thought about it, hopefully. There's a lot of steps, as you mentioned, in going through a process of exploration like this. And there is a lot of decision-making that has to happen, within a certain timeline if we want to move forward with this by next year. So it brings the question to mind: what would change this trajectory for you? Like, what would you have to hear back? And it doesn't even have to be super detailed, but just, what, if anything, it can't just be the school committee vote in the fall, right? It has to be something else or some things else along the way. And maybe you've thought about what the challenges might be in the district. I just want to hear about that a little bit too, because I think that can be very helpful to us as we're going through this decision-making together.
Yeah. So on the socioeconomic piece, one way that, think about how to take a step back. So is it okay if I take a step back to the enrollment working group report? Because actually I think that would be helpful then to drive the connection. So one of the concerns that was expressed by the enrollment working group that looked at socioeconomic balance was a growing imbalance between our three schools as it relates to the concentration of poverty. And so if there's a lottery system or a partial lottery system for acceptance, and this gets to Mr. Demling's comment a little bit as well, because I've worried about the same thing. But one way that one could approach that is that the lottery could weigh socioeconomics such that it could balance out. So, for instance, if Fort River became the school that was the most affluent relative to the data that we have, that you could prioritize students who receive subsidized lunch, income-eligible students, to enter the program via lottery to balance that out. If Fort River, as it is now, is on the opposite end of the socioeconomic piece, right, so there's a higher concentration of poverty, one could balance that out if families who are not low income chose to enter the lottery by advantaging those students to get into it. Mr. Deming's point is one that I've thought of, that, it feels sort of uncomfortable to think about doing that. And I think it depends what our goals and outcomes are and our comfort level with that. I think based on the feedback I received from the enrollment working group, I think it's worth exploring, not necessarily making a recommendation on that front, but it would allow for a very gradual evening out of demographics. And if the thing that I think is particularly attractive to me and why I think it should be considered and explored is it allows that to happen over time, right? So it's not a full swoop, kids have to change schools, but also it would allow for other housing demographic changes to be managed that way. So for instance, if things flip 5 years from now and Fort River, there's new growth in the Fort River, like a whole host of factors, and all of a sudden Fort River, the numbers shift. Because, I mean, when I was at Crocker Farm, it was the opposite, right? Just to frame conversations, these things are cyclical. Some of that was based on well, there's a lot of factors that went into it, but the reality was, when I got to Crocker Farm, it had twice the free reduced lunch percentage of either of the other schools, right? So it allows for cyclical changes in housing patterns to be managed on a gradual, ongoing basis without changing any students' schools by just managing the lottery process. So that's what's attractive. The unintended consequences that Mr. Demling said, are we comfortable as a community with having that as a factor in a lottery system? I think that's a really open question. Does that help?
A little bit. I mean, just if I can
Yes,
comment
Alicia.
on that. So I think, it helps to hear that the thinking is that the lottery might help with the balance. The caveat, which is a pretty big one, is based on Mr. Demling's comment earlier.
Right.
About how that might function. So, a lottery system that is limiting in its very nature by the way that it's designed for this specific purpose could also be incredibly frustrating to a lot of families,
That's
right?
right.
And so I think we really want to think about that and balance that out, because the excitement, again, from so many families at this point, or even just hearing about this
Right.
possibility, is that, wow, my kid, or my future kid might go into this and,
Right.
be a part of this, which would be very exciting. But if we have a lottery that is being set up in that way with this specific intent, it's definitely, it could be concerning for some folks in the community, and it could be a little divisive as well. So,
Oh, yeah.
it helps to hear you kind of put it in that way, but I think we definitely want to just keep exploring and thinking about it, a lot more.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue to the second question you
Yeah.
asked, which is, I use an example of another community, not Princeton in New Jersey, that this is the issue they're stuck on, and it's been 4 years and no program started. So when you said about the question about what could influence the timeline, I mean, there's all the educational pieces, and as much as I go back to my comment earlier, I've read, I've heard, I've talked to people, I really want to see it, right? And that's just me as a learner. Like, if I'm going to bring to you a formal recommendation, I think that's what I need to do. Look at similar communities. What are some of the pitfalls similar communities have faced? How have they overcome them? And I want to have more data that I don't have right now that. To recommend it, I think working out whether it's a neighborhood zoning only or a lottery system, I think that your point could be highly contentious and could derail things, if done well, if not done well. I mean, I think it has the potential of being highly controversial. I think that's the word you used, and I think that's spot on. I think on some of the other ones, because we're mostly talking about dual language here, I think the special ed one, I really need to get feedback. The CPAC chair is wonderful. And we need to talk to specific families, specific staff. I mean, today was a generalized staff, but about how would that work? Because there's currently a couple shared staff members between the two programs. How would the roles and responsibilities shift with that? What would be the influence on the other building staffing? Where space? I mean, there's a lot of details that would need to be worked out on the special ed front, particularly. I mean, preschool. I think I'm going to be hard pressed. It's not because of lack of interest or lack of enthusiasm to think of coming up with expanding our preschool model by October, just because fiscally I don't think it's feasible. It's not because I don't think it should be, and I think all the comments that were made before by Mr. Demling about finances, I fully agree with. But I think what I need to do is get a lot more engagement, and I really need to connect with preschool families. That's the other piece I wanted to mention. So it's not that I don't love the families that are like you all, that have some of you here who have two of the four of students in the elementary level. But really the target demographic on the dual language front are students who are, particularly 2, 3, and 4, families of children who are 2, 3, and some 4-year-olds, depending on their birth date. And so that's what the April 4th piece is starting to get at. So we have a lot of, the UMass group got data from that group, and I know the survey got a lot of preschool families, but I think people can want things in theory, and I heard this from multiple districts. And when it's your kid and you're saying, not that I just want this theoretical, great to have a bilingual child, I'm passionate, but what are you going to do when X happens? Is my kid going to be scared and confused when on the third day of school, half of the language instruction, or half of the program's in a language he's never heard before, right? There's a very real concerns that will emerge as what shapes into a proposal gets more finite and more specific. And so I don't want to be dampening the enthusiasm I'm hearing from people in the community, but what I heard from Somerville in particular, they thought, I mean, they do have a lot of interest in the program, but they thought, oh, everyone's going to want to be in. And that was not the case. And that's why a lot of these schools have monolingual classes, because for lots of really good reasons, families make choices, and we want to honor those. And so what I'd say is right now I've not hit the right demographic to come back to you with saying, well, I've spoken to this group, and it's not that I disregard the other, but I want to talk to the families who are going to be directly affected, see what questions they have, see how, working with Ms. Hardy, how we interact. And that hasn't happened to date.
Thank you.
Yep.
So, I have a few things on my mind after this. By the way, thank you. I mean, as a first order sort of a business, obviously this is building off the enrollment working group. I mean, I just would endorse that process and say it was extraordinarily successful. I think when we talked about this a year ago, because we just had a lot of stuff on our minds that we were dealing with in general, it was hard to really imagine what would the work product look like. And so it seems like something that should be done, it is valuable and would have been valuable regardless what we got out of it. I think it's worth saying again, and I know everyone said this here already, that what has come out of it, both in terms of engagement of staff, of the community, of the quality of, frankly, the work product, is just really extraordinarily high. And you wouldn't have been able to do, I know you called this response to enrollment working group, which is sort of nicely named, because without the enrollment working group, you couldn't have a response. But I mean, honestly, if you wouldn't have been able to do what you did without everyone being involved in the way that they were. So we'll lead me to two things. One, since you were asking for feedback earlier, I'd love to see you continue down this road. But I'd also say I'd love to see you continue down this road in the way that you've been going down this road, which echoes something that both Mr. Demling, all three of my colleagues, but I mean, what I love about working with all of you is that something that each of you has said was something when I was writing my notes, I got to say this. If no one else says this, I want to say this, and then I'm like hearing you say it, and I'm like, that's kind of cool. So, a few of them, one on decision points. I think it's really, I'm not just going to echo what Ms. Adoni said about being really clear around the timeline and the process. I think for both the school committee and for the public and others, I think working out the next level down cut of your schedule in ways that allow the public on multiple fronts in the committee to interact with you on these things, because the real risk is, having done such a great job of doing an open process now, you end up getting into I'm not going to belabor the specifics of them because we've already talked about some of them. You get down into the question of how you do the lottery or even the staffing changes or whatever it is, and it starts to feel like a fait accompli, and you're not intending it to be, and you've had conversations with people. And so I know you've been doing this, but I think anything you can do, not to be cautious, but just to be methodical about it, I think is extraordinarily valuable to do. And especially because I'd echo something you said a moment ago. Everyone in town may love this, and so then there may be many parents who want to have their kids involved more than we have slots for. There also may be many parents too who love it and are glad it's here and want their child to be in a different learning environment. And so thinking about that too, I think, as you are doing, is extremely valuable. So the slow is good in that regard, and I know that's going to be frustrating for many people, but since I've now been, I think, to 2 town meetings, where, I know I could have been to more, but I was just to those 2 sessions as a member, where we were getting banged on for the fact that we hadn't done enough on world languages. I think the notion that we're definitively moving on that, not definitively, you said distinctly not definitively.
Potentially.
Potentially definitively.
Definitively
We may get there.
studying, right?
We're definitively studying, and we're moving methodically on this path. Getting there right and also getting there is more important than raising high expectations and then being like the case study you're mentioning, where they tried it and then now they're floundering and failing, or more importantly, that there's all sorts of whispers going on about what's going to happen to someone's child, and their child is 5, and it's a nerve-wracking for them, right? It's got to be, right? It's the worst situation we could be in. And so if slow and methodical and communication get us there, and get us there by October, all for the better. The next thing I'd say on this is, you and I talked about this briefly a little while ago. I love what you're talking about doing with Crocker and Wildwood. Absolutely love it. And I'm going to give a reason, because I'm I'm not a principal at either school. I'm going to give a somewhat different reason for why I'm saying that. The nature of the beast is the further you move toward, look, our elementary schools are adored, and they're wonderful communities, learning communities that are deeply adored by our town, by the people in our town. The farther you move along with the potential dual language school at Fort River, the more the energy and the excitement starts to run toward that shiny new object. And the attention runs to the shiny new object. And then as much as people adore the schools that they're in, they start to wonder, because we do have scarce resources, because there is scarce time and attention, because people worry that if you're really excited about this thing over here, does that mean you're excited about this thing over here, right? And so the only way you can do that and guard against it is by setting up a culture in which the expectation is that Crocker and Wildwood, if it is Fort River, and you stick with that Crocker and Wildwood also are coming up with exciting plans. And because it's an announced strategy and a declared ambition, this means the principals and all the parents and the PGOs and everyone else and the teachers can, I'm being funny about this, but I mean it, can bang on you and can bang on the school committee and say, hey, when you're finding resources to do curriculum that needs to be implemented at Fort River, guess what? We've come up with our program and our priorities. You got to work this into the calculus because you've promised that we were going to do this in a way that it really valued all three schools. And if we do that right, not only will it really help the schools in all the ways that they're much more expert than I'll ever be on why that's important to do, as a community strategy and as a district strategy, it gives us a model for engagement with parents and the community as a whole in town meeting and everyone else we're working with that's going to make them feel really good about how we're investing in this approach. And what echoes from there, and I'll stop in 2 seconds, but what echoes down from there is things like thinking through and working with CPAC and parents and others, teachers, about what we do with building blocks and sort of balancing the programs, figuring that out and getting that right. And then I agree with you, there's no October strategy around preschool, but I would I've been banging on this, and Mr. Demley had probably one of the worst 10-minute conversations in front of town hall where I was just basically going off on the importance of, you agree, I know you agree immediately, but I was going off on the importance of preschool, like a maniac. I would love to, I know you got to figure it out, but figuring out what the next things to do with other resources in the valley, with promoting it in the town, and then thinking through if we had resources, how would we do it? I think even if it's not an October strategy that's put forward, I think it's worth thinking through what would be the next steps maybe for the next year as a whole to continue engaging on different things in that area. Because I know a priority that's not being acted on is a priority that's lost. Right. And this, I'm not saying these other things aren't probably immediately more actionable, I'm sure they are. But figuring out those things too, I think would be valuable in the mix, and I'm sure you're going to do that anyway. But cede the balance of my oxygen to someone else.
And so, thank you all, and I would like to open it up for any comments or questions that might come from the public. Are you interested? Okay.
I'd
Say your
just like
name
to,
first.
I'm Jeff Lee. I was on the enrollment working group, and I would just like to thank you all for providing me the opportunity to participate. It was really a spectacular experience. I learned a ton, got to meet a lot of nice people, and as you know, it came at a critical time when emotions were kind of raw over the Wildwood vote, but I think we learned that whatever your opinion, we all care about the schools and can work together. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Jeff, I used your data in my report. Dr. Morris used yours in his report, so clearly we appreciate your contributions. Thank you. Okay, are we sort of ready to move ahead? Yeah, okay, great. And I just want to say that I feel like I'm seeing this like graphic forming that's, we've got the path, and I keep thinking the word mosaic. I feel like the way this all fits together is a mosaic, and so that's the challenge for the next, come up with something that incorporates all those. The theme. Don't you see what I'm
I see what you're saying.
Maybe
I
there's
actually
the Emerald City at the end.
Well, I was just going to
Bricks.
say,
There you
that
go.
path felt like the
See
yellow
what I
brick
mean?
road. Yes,
There
That's
you
where
go.
I'm
no
going.
idea where it's going to end.
Yeah.
but
That's right.
It's all good.
It's all good.
There's no place like Amherst. Keep clicking your heels and saying that.
Okay, so we have superintendent update next.
Wow.
We're going to do this. Good.
I think you all have that. Just because Nick and Derek weren't here before they leave, something I shared earlier was just an appreciation for how today went in terms of it's a big day in schools across the country, and the principal's ability to actively support students, upper grade students and lower grade students in a different way, particularly upper grade students in terms of their interest and capacity to choose, if they wanted to choose to be involved in the national protest, in just the most developmentally appropriate way, where it was a meaningful experience that students will remember for an awful long time. And then for students who didn't protest, they had a really wonderful day of school as well. So I really want to thank principals. I don't want to say it's easier than the middle school or high school, or harder than the middle school or high school, because I think it's just different's the right word. But thinking about 7 or 9 grade spans in one building, and how to manage that in a sensitive way to understand the developmental needs of 11 and 12-year-olds and differently about 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-olds was a really unique task. It wasn't alone. There was a big article in the New York Times this morning about that very thing, and I just really want to thank, and Ms. Chamberlain's at Pine Night, so she's not here, but thank all 3 elementary principals for meeting that challenge and supporting our students with a range of opinion, a range of age levels, and a range of developmental levels. So I want to say that out loud with you both here. Yeah.
Thank you.
So other things in the update, once again, I'll probably go quicker than I'd like to. And we met Monday, and so some of these district-wide ones, I know not everyone in the audience was here, but we had a wonderful curriculum day last Friday around equity and diversity, and you can see the different topics that we're focused on. Today, both in the morning and the afternoon, Jessica Minahan, who's a BCBA is board certified behavior analyst. She used to work in the Cambridge and Newton public schools, but now that she's written a book, she does a lot of kind of bigger, broader work. And she was fantastic. I was able to sit in on some of the session this morning with the mental health professionals across the district. In the afternoon was a more general audience of staff members. And I'll just say, really focused on, particularly on anxiety, students with anxiety and what that looks like, and looking at behavior is an opportunity to understand behavior as communication. Right, so if you can look at behavior as communication, you can analyze it a lot better and thinking about what's actually contributing to that. And a paraeducator, I think it was notable that we have 4 different groups of staff members. We had secondary paraeducators who end their day before, secondary teachers who end their day before, elementary paraeducators who end their day before elementary teachers. So we let her know that people would be leaving throughout, right, because their workday ended. And the number of people who stayed until 3:31 when she ended was the majority. Like, we said to people clearly, like, you got to leave when your workday ends. It's not, but she was so engaging, and the content was so valuable. Paraeducator who walked out said, could she come every week? I mean, it really was shifting and shifted my thoughts on how to work with children. I think I'm going to just talk about the Amherst updates in terms of the other ones, unless, oh yeah.
I'm sorry, can I just ask one question about the last
Yeah.
point that you raised? So, one of the things that I've heard repeatedly from educators in the district, and I'm sure you hear it too, is on this question about behavior and discipline in the classroom. And teachers expressing concern, that a lot of students are, behaving and sort of acting out in classroom setting. And I think 2 of our elementary schools have very challenging physical environments for that kind of thing, right? Because they are shared spaces, and so, it's not just a disruption to one class, but a disruption to multiple classes simultaneously. And so you're mentioning, you're joking around about the one educator saying, could she come every week? I am wondering, actually, if it is worth exploring having additional, sort of moments where someone like her or herself. I also would love to hear something about trauma-informed, looking at this through a trauma-informed lens. If there's anyone that's specializing in that kind of training as well, because it does seem to keep coming up among our educators, and it is a concern, I'm sure, for families as well.
Right. Yeah, and something I meant to share in this presentation, which I'm now going to take off the screen, sorry about that, that I did when I went to schools after I was hired this year. Absolutely want to support that opinion, that I did hear the same thing from educators around that. And in particular at Fort River, and I meant to say this when I was talking about the presentation, there was universal love for the specialized programs, And there was also universal, of the 22 members, staff members who went, universal concern about the percentage of students with special needs in one building. Not because of those students who are in specialized programs, but the amount of resources that went to them was taking away from the next tier of students. That just the capacity to manage that was a real challenge. So when I talked about the building blocks piece and moving it, I want to be really clear that it wasn't a direct suggestion from Fort River staff members, but the feeling of, because of the needs of having both 2 building blocks classes and an Ames classroom, that managing the behaviors building-wide was becoming a larger challenge. More specifically to your point, we do have BCBAs on staff and mental health team providers, and the point of the morning session was, it wasn't quite train the trainer, but it was focused on that. How do we provide our mental health team members and our behavior analysts with the skill sets to be more effective in working with teachers around it? We have worked with Riverside, looking at Faye to make sure I'm right, Riverside, which is a Eastern Mass-based organization, Riverside Trauma Center, and they've done trainings in our schools around trauma-informed classrooms, trauma-informed schools, and there's more ongoing work that I know our schools are taking up on that. But she was particularly, so I've read her book. It's really good. I mean, it really frames trying to understand behaviors and come up with strategies that are effective. And thinking of, I mean, the example that sticks in my head from today is, so you have a young child who drops crayons, right? So many people's instinct, my own included, is to say, you got to pick up the crayons, and then maybe later say, because someone could trip on them, right? So the young child doesn't hear the second thing, right? Thinking about how do we actually identify, if that's a challenging behavior, the issue with the behavior, and have that lead the conversation instead of the more consequence feeling thing, because it really shifts how students respond. And that's low-hanging fruit. There was more deeper ones, but that's the one, some reason I'm thinking of. I'd be very interested in continuing to partner with, and the feedback, I wasn't the only one. I know I've talked to Faye. We received was incredibly strong from faculty members and staff. And part of it's that she's particularly good, and part of it's also that she's relatable. She was a special educator. She worked in schools that don't look wildly different than our schools. So the stories she was telling were stories that resonated with our teachers, and it felt like, oh, she could have been in Amherst and be telling the same stories. It wasn't like an academic lens that sometimes feels one step removed from the day-to-day experience of our staff. So really exciting. We applied and we received a grant, 3 grants, one each for Crocker Farm, Fort River, and Wildwood from the Whole Kids Foundation, which is part of Whole Foods, to support and expand our gardening program, which is wonderful. It was a very competitive grant process. The vast majority, I don't have the data with me, I'm sorry, vast majority of applicants were not received, so for us to receive one for each of our elementary schools was fantastic. The information session we had on March 1st was also, the good news was more people came than we were expecting, so we were very tight in the Crocker Farm Library, but that was a good problem to have. Lots of young children got books that they wanted to read, and we figured out a system to return those, but that was a good thing. We learned our lesson. Perhaps the library might not be we want young children reading. I'm not sure the library was the best place, but thank goodness for Waleska, who's wonderfully patient at Crocker Farm. But it went really well. We were expecting 25, 30 people. We had 55 folks come. And well, many of them, the structure was myself and the principals and some other people did kind of 2-minute spiels. And then we did question and answer. And then each person set up in a certain part of the school, in the room, and then parents could go up. So if you were zoned to Wildwood, you got a chance to meet Nick and have some small group or individual conversations. If you were zoned to Fort River, you got to meet Diane, right? And if you were interested in food, which many people were, you got to meet Ryan and ask questions about nutrition. Dwayne was a very popular person that night about after school. A lot of questions that families have before they register. When does school start? When does it end? Oh my God, it ends, or it starts then. I have to get to work, right? And we have to do this every year. It was really positive. We did have some families come who were interested in school choice too, and we're not wanting, perhaps, or lacking school choice interest, but it was great to have those families get to experience our district because they said they were interested in choice, not necessarily they were applying, and all of them afterwards said, oh, this is great, and we had the applications there for them to take home if they wanted, and we've received a bunch since that evening. So really exciting. And then kindergarten registration is just saying it in public. It was supposed to be last Thursday. We didn't have school last Thursday. We've had kindergarten registration during the day, but we have an evening event each year. Got snowed out last week, didn't stop people from coming, but luckily some of our staff on the snow day were still here at 6 o'clock. So Mr. Sheehan was one of them. I think he might have left. So So we put up a sign and let them know it is tomorrow night, which is the 15th of March at 6 o'clock over at the middle school, which is where our registrar, Jadira Torres, works.
Great, thank you. Yes,
Just real quick question back to the grants. So I know it's only $2,000, but, you know, we get these like grants and these gifts, it seems like fairly frequently, and I was wondering if you feel like, do we have a really great way of thanking that business or that organization in a visible way? And I'm thinking about this continuing to try and nurture community school connections, right? And it's a small amount of money, but, you know, like you said, it's a competitive grant and, you know, it has a big impact.
Yeah, it does.
You know, your thoughts on that?
So we do thank you notes, but that's not public. I thank them on Twitter and tag them, which they must have someone whose job it is at Whole Foods to be online all the time, because I think it was like 3 seconds later it was like reposted and you know, or retweeted, or I'm sorry, I don't have the lingo. And so and part of it's doing things like this, like announcing it at public meetings. But if there are other suggestions, and it doesn't have to be now, please definitely share them, because we are appreciative. And, you know, we always have to be slightly cautious when it's local, when it's a company that has a local branch, and seeing that we're not promoting that. So that it gets a little bit, I'm very cautious around that. It's not that I have nothing against Whole Foods, but I also have nothing against Trader Joe's or Stop and Shop or Big Y. Right, so I think that the balance is slightly tricky on that, because you can be perceived as endorsing pretty quickly. But any suggestions, I'm more than open to.
so I apologize to those waiting. Could we take a 2-minute break? So
Sure.
that we could,
I can get water.
Just get water, but I'll stick to 2 minutes. All right, we're back. Thank you very much.
Are you eating?
I'm sorry. A little bit of a headache. Okay. Okay, before we go on, I'm just wondering if everyone's comfortable moving the MSBA SOI vote after the budget vote, since Mr. McPherson is here, and you can then do that and move on.
Sure.
Yep, okay. Okay, so budget, Mr. Mangano.
Eat your vegetables.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. So sorry, Debbie. Didn't see you behind me.
So, in front of you is the motion language for the vote tonight. The budget, again, that you're voting on is $23,227,365 for fiscal year 2019, and that's a 3.1% increase over the FY18 budget. Happy to answer any questions that may be lingering before you vote.
So I think just two things quickly. We don't have any changes in terms of ad cuts since the budget hearing. I think a little more to share about preschool, not about the enrollment working group report, but there was an ad for $7,000. There's been a process to gather input. I actually sat in on one of the meetings with paraeducators as well as professional staff in the preschool of how to ensure that we're going to comply with the need for IEPs. We're close to resolution. I was hoping we'd be like 100% there, and we're not quite 100% there, just in terms of all the mechanics and details. But I do think for a future agenda, I'm not quite sure who the vice chair is. He the vice chair?
Yep.
So for Ms. Ordonez, I think it'd be good to come back to at our next Amherst School Committee meeting when there's a little more clarity on all the details, but we continue to gather staff input, including multiple emails today that I received, as well as Ms. Smith and Michelle, who you met earlier tonight, about how to ensure that our program works for all students. And some of it's about I think, two different frames. One is about how do we ensure enough slots for students with IEPs, and then also a second equally important question for me is, given the needs of the students we're having and the ending of the state grant, do we have some flexibility? Should we enact some flexibility about not necessarily having students in an integrated program all day long? Are there students who are better set in more of an ABA-style program in the morning and an integrated program in the afternoon to have their needs met? So I think both those variables are being discussed within budget constraints. And the feedback I heard from faculty and staff was for the addition really to be focused on providing continued, kind of relates to a prior conversation, behavior analyst support, folks who specialize in incredibly, very relative to the district, very young students, and providing more support for staff, both paraeducator staff and professional staff. And so that's what we're looking at.
Any questions? Comments? Yeah.
So this is by far the shortest document we've received on the budget. Ironic, given that this is the most important vote. Just because I like to have it described at every possible budget meeting, because it is so important to understand about the budget, could you just, again, say what the cut is?
The total?
Yeah, and also
yeah.
describe in your own clear words, which you've done 100 times, but I think it's good for people who are just listening, the impact of the health insurance and how that factors into the budget.
Sure. So the exact cut, don't have off the top of my head, but it's about $537,000. That chart last time that we looked at, I think, illustrated the best, which the health insurance alone in this year's budget went up about $900,000. So that had by far the biggest impact on the budget and put us into a position where we had to make reductions this year. And we're still working on resolution for next year. Closer, but still working on it. Yep.
Yeah.
Closer with update or just closer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only update I'll make is that the Insurance Advisory Committee had a meeting, and they voted a recommendation to the town manager that would sort of constrain costs a little bit for the district, which would be a positive thing.
Yeah.
So that happened last week, or the end of the week, 2 weeks ago, yeah. So that's the only update since I think the last time we met on the budget.
So I think the only thing, just to put a clarifying piece that's unique, and we're still working with the Teachers Association, as is the town, because there's a contract language component to that would have to be involved in any implementation.
Yeah,
of
this
that
is
vote.
just a recommendation to the town manager who ultimately has to make a decision.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was going to be my question, so I got it.
Good.
Great. Do I have a motion? Yeah.
Move to adopt a budget of $23,227,365 for fiscal year 2019 for the Amherst Elementary Schools.
Second?
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. Yeah?
So this is the first time I voted the Amherst budget, right? It's so strange with all the engagement that we do on the budget all year, and the vote is like that. I mean, I guess it's ironically a testament to the fact that we have thoroughly gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb again and again, but it's just very strange that the very final step is so short.
But due to fiscal considerations, the fireworks, bunting,
Fireworks
balloons,
budget
and
was
cake were canceled this year, Mr. Demling, so it's...
I mean, it's a pretty
We're doing
lengthy
a strict
process
conversion.
leading up to it.
Oh,
So that you hope that by the
that's
time
what I
you get
mean.
here,
Yes,
that's
yes.
pretty much where
I
you
mean,
are,
yeah,
right?
yes.
I would think.
It's just funny to
Yeah.
And just
Yeah.
very,
Oh, yeah.
No.
so just very quickly, I just wanted to, again, say thank you to Mr. Mangano and to Dr. Morris for leading us through this process. And that cut of $537,000 was obviously an extremely painful cut. We had a lot of deep conversations around that in all the meetings leading up to this meeting today and this vote. And I know that, none of us have gone through this lightly. It's been very hard to understand, where these cuts had to happen, and to try to take as little as possible from the core programs that would actually impact our students and families and our schools. So I am, deeply appreciative to them, as well as to our principals and our educators and all the staff who have touched this, because their input throughout the last few months also has helped ensure that we've been able to keep these cuts to a minimum. So thank you.
And I think the only thing I was going to note, and maybe I'm misinterpreting Mr. Demling's comment, but just on the how much different it is, even literally voting on the budget of region with the amount of words that I believe you were the one who read on Monday night, and the complexity of having 4 towns and assessment methodology, as opposed to being a part of one town. So separate from the budget cut and impact, just the functional piece is really different than a regional district. And I know there's a lot of advocacy on regional districts across the state, and the complexity of them, it's not good, bad, but the complexity of them feels markedly different. And I'm not sure if you're noting that, but I wanted to say it out loud as well.
You okay to move on?
Yeah, we could move on.
And what we could, and Mr. McPherson, I'd like to invite him up for our, we're going to talk about the MSBA statement of interest.
Very good. So I appreciate the commentary. It was very helpful to clarify exactly what was going into the statement. It was noted that this is a significant repeat of what was submitted before. Probably 3/4 is the same. It was my understanding that this was a winning application before. I wanted to sustain that, and with everybody's help, we've updated it. Not a whole lot to talk about as far as the content. We've prioritized Fort River as we talked about before. We've eliminated the references to the Chinese program that has subsequently been eliminated, and I think we're in a good position to apply.
Yep.
Questions?
And pending, just process-wise, pending the vote tonight, the select board, if there's an affirmative vote tonight, and it's not coercion, it's just process, the select board will take this up, I believe, on Monday.
Yes.
So that we meet our timeline to get it to the MSBA well ahead of April 6th, which is the deadline. Even once both bodies vote on it, there's a bunch of signatures, and there's some technical aspects that take a good bit of time. I wouldn't want to leave it till the night before for the select board.
And specifically, there's vote language that was provided that apparently must be adhered to very literally.
So at our last meeting, we asked the question about, I'm just looking on page 4, where it says potential project scope, and it says renovation/addition, and I know that was what was on the previous
Yes.
application that
Yes.
also included replacement, but we just
Yes.
wanted to be very clear that option was also included.
So our options are accelerated repair, potential consolidation, potential new school, renovation addition, repair project. So this seems to us to be the most effective, accurate, and flexible.
When you said those were the options we had to choose from?
It's a pull-down menu, and those are our options.
And the one was renovation addition?
Yes. Renovation addition, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know if you're going to ask the same question.
Go
So
ahead.
I heard you say potential new school.
Right.
So again, just, we wanted, I think Mr. Nakajima had asked that pointed question last time about whether or not this language is the absolute right language, in case we end up going in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, that's
That's what you
we talked
understood.
about this, and
Yeah.
that was the language on the 2013 statement of interest, and I think it's frankly a placeholder language. I mean, some communities are really clear from the beginning. They want they have to go through a process, even if they, again, decontextualizing it from Amherst, they know they want to renovate the building. They don't have land for, I'm thinking of Somerville High School as being an example where, there's no place in Somerville to rebuild, right? So you're going to do renovation. They still had to look and do an analysis of all the sites in Somerville. Was there any space large enough? So there's no, it doesn't cue you into a certain line if you get into the MSBA, depending on that question. It's trying to just gather some initial thoughts, but it doesn't have an impact on how they read it, nor if you were to get in, if a town or district was to get in, how the process would be dictated from there.
Okay, I think that answers our question.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Would you like, yep?
Yeah, I'm really sorry to belabor the point, but just so I'm 100%,
Right.
just to restate what you just said.
Sure.
Right, so if right now, given the fact that we don't have full information, renovation, addition, new building, those are all potentials, that by selecting this one value in this application, it doesn't state our preference for any one of those three. It's just we have to select one of those values, and if you have potentially equal possibility there, it doesn't impact that preference.
Yeah, I'll go further
Am I stating that
yeah. So if you select something, you still have to study all the other options.
Yes.
Right, so if you said new construction
Right.
and you were to get in, it wouldn't be like, great, they don't have to study renovation. You would be absolutely required as part of the process to have a serious study of renovation on that first tier of work with the designer. It doesn't exempt you. It really doesn't limit you at all. It's quite the opposite. You can't make that decision now and just say, no, we're only focusing on that. You would be disqualified from the program if you tried to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
I'd like to make a motion,
Okay. Oh,
but I wanted to ask a question. I'm sorry.
I had
we're
one
not
more
ready to get there.
question.
No, I'm sorry.
But I could
No,
talk
it's
about it
okay.
after we make the motion.
No,
but-
it's okay.
Would you ask your question first?
I think the motion is wrong as written. Having convened an open session on March 13th, I think we mean 14th. Which then the question would be, does that mean that the interest form dated that's referenced in the next sentence, would that be the 15th or would that still be the 14th?
So,
Are we moving everything down one day or not?
yes, so it is important that the statement of interest form be dated after the open meeting.
Okay, so that
And-
means that means it should be rewritten to say, on the first date listed, March 14th.
Yes,
And then on the second date, March 15th.
yes.
Okay.
Thank you, that's a good question.
Okay.
And this is something, and I may have gotten clarification, but we received a question about, it's on page 10 of the Wildwood one. Maybe this isn't, yes, about the boiler at Wildwood, just because we did
yes.
fund, town meeting funded a boiler, and yet this says that that's not in process, so
So
clarify.
we're not asking for funding from MSBA to replace the boiler.
Uh-huh.
And the boiler's not complete yet, so we're in the line between those two operations.
So when it says, is the district seeking replacement of the boiler from the MSBA?
Correct.
Is what that means, not
Correct.
in general,
Correct.
okay, makes sense. Okay, yes. Is there any other questions before we, yeah, go ahead.
I move that the committee adopt resolved, having convened in an open meeting on March 14th, 2018, prior to the statement of interest submission closing date, the school committee of Amherst, Massachusetts, in accordance with its charter, bylaws, and ordinances, has voted to authorize the superintendent to submit to the Massachusetts School Building Authority the statement of interest form dated March 15th, 2018, for the Wildwood Elementary School located at 71 Strong Street, Amherst, Massachusetts, 01002, which describes and explains the following deficiencies in the priority categories for which an application may be submitted to the Massachusetts School Building Authority in the future. Priority 1, building jeopardizing student health, poor health and learning environment. Priority 5, modernization of school facilities systems, poor energy efficiency and poor operating efficiency. Priority 7, obsolete building, poor educational spatial utilization, and hereby further specifically acknowledges that by submitting the statement of interest form, the Massachusetts School Building Authority in no way guarantees the acceptance or the approval of an application, the awarding of a grant, or any other funding commitment from the Massachusetts School Building Authority, or commits the city, town, regional school district to filing an application for funding with the Massachusetts School Building Authority.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Yes.
So, I'll try to make this comment as brief as possible, but projecting that we're not going to be talking about long-term solutions to these buildings for quite a while, I just want to say one thing. For me, voting yes on this is a no-brainer. Obviously, we are going to submit for both of these buildings to the MSBA. But, you know, in looking through all this documentation, I was harking back to last April in the post-building project and, you know, what's the steps forward. That's where all the enrollment working group study came out of. But part of that presentation as well was, okay, what's the timeline going forward if we go to MSBA? And with the timeline that Dr. Morris laid out, when you do one MSBA project after another MSBA project, even in the most optimistic timeline, getting accepted on your very first go for both buildings and everything humming along, we finished both these buildings in 2032. And so that's the default path we're on because that's the only path that we have. And so I have no problem being on that path for now. But because at the best case scenario, it ends in 2032, it's not something I can endorse as the preferred path because I don't feel that it's educationally responsible. So I'm very happy to take this vote to go down this path because we have no other option. And, you know, and so when I think about the alternative there, we bump up against the other variable that we've all discussed and that the community's discussed at length, which is, well, where's the money then if we don't go to the MSBA? You know, in the most extreme example, we could go and ask the town tomorrow for $80 million for new or like new buildings, you know, for a long-term solutions, not kick the can down the road repair, but a long-term solution. And I mean, not only putting aside the question of political feasibility, I think that would be absurd to to do politically, it's not financially responsible to the town, in my view, to ask for that level of a financial commitment. Given our current tax rate and given the other very worthwhile capital projects the town is facing, not the least of which is a fire station. And so, on both of those points, that's not financially responsible and the waiting to the 2030s or longer is not educationally responsible, I find actually a very large level of consensus in the community. When we talk about the building project, we always talk about the divisions, but you know, it's been about a year and I've made it a point to try and talk to people on both sides of the building project last time, particularly to those who opposed it because I supported it and so I wanted to really get feedback. And while there's certainly strong disagreement about why things happened the way they did, going forward, I find unanimity on we don't want to wait to the 2030s and we can't spend $80 million, right? And so I think just having that level of agreement in the community is, to me, a somewhat hopeful sign. And I think it should encourage the school committee and the superintendent to keep our eyes open for any creative, practical solution that solves both those variables. And I don't think that's, you know, I want to be clear, I don't think that's happening any day or week soon, but I can, you know, in the coming months and years, we have some possibilities of some flexibility. We're at the earliest stages of exploring regionalization with Pelham. They have a building, that might come into play. Who knows if that's going to happen? We're at the earliest stages of a building use study at the regional level. That might allow some space for the 6th grade. We have no idea, that's a long way off. We have the Fort River Feasibility Committee, which a year from now will be in have much more results that will give us some clarity on our options. So it's a hard place to be in when I talk to people about what the solution is, because it, to me, requires that we embrace a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? That this is a problem that needs to be solved and we don't have a solution. But I think philosophically, you know, for me, it's important to embrace this as the most practical option we have now, but to at the same time be vigilant for practical solutions that can come before that. So it was longer than I wanted to, but it was knowing this topic is going to come up for a long time.
Thank you. And I think that's an important point to make, that I think as a school committee, by voting for this, we're not endorsing a lack of urgency. Any other comments? Yeah.
I would,
No, mine's a non sequitur.
I was just, mine's not exactly a non sequitur, but I'd also say it's always darkest before the dawn. And we earlier looked at the enrollment working groups that a year ago when formed, wasn't clear where they were leading and how productive they'd be. And we just went through a review of work that was actually extraordinarily fruitful and a potential pathway, not known yet, but a potential pathway that looks promising for our district to be able to resolve longstanding needs and interests that the community has long expressed, many staff people and educators have expressed, lots of people. And so this is a step we need to take. I guess I'm going to say, even though there's no good reason to do so, temperamentally, I'm more glass half full than glass half empty, that if we look at the creative possibilities that you identified earlier, there may be more we can embrace in the future that make this thing a lot less hopeless than 2032, in fact, a lot sooner. And I think we should just put our creative energies behind that. And if we do, I think we'll make a lot of positive progress.
I appreciate your optimism. I'm glad you're on the committee. The glass needs to be half
I
full.
feel like mine is like a very narrow point, so
That's fine.
it really is a non sequitur.
That's fine.
But one thing I know that a couple community members and committee members were interested in is just a quick update. You know, there were concerns a couple weeks ago. We had a rainstorm and we had multiple of our school buildings, and the middle school still has some creative solutions that Mr. McPherson has come up, but there was concerns about Fort River on the elementary side, although we also had problems at Crocker Farm as well, and roofs and leaks during it was during our non-snowy wet season. And I know, so I asked Mr. McPherson if he could just briefly summarize what he saw, what the work on the capital plan for Fort River roof, would it address it, and just a little bit of things about spring as we eventually will thaw out.
Would we like to do that now?
Should we finish our vote?
Yeah, that's what I was
first? Yeah, let's finish
asking.
our-
I just
Thank you.
wanted to,
I should
I know
have
that.
we talked about
A
that.
couple people had asked
Yeah.
me to raise that topic during this agenda topic, during this moment,
Yes.
so. yeah.
So any further discussion about the SOI before we take a vote? So we have a motion and a second. So all those in favor? Great, thank you very much.
And we have a similar vote for
Yeah, I was
Fort
gonna
River.
say,
Same motion, I'm back.
Oh, yes, okay. Would someone like to make that motion?
Yeah.
Mr. Nakajima, yeah.
Moved that the committee approve the following. Resolved, having convened in an open meeting on March 14th, 2018, prior to the SOI submission closing date, the School Committee of Amherst, Massachusetts, in accordance with its charter, bylaws, and ordinances, has voted to authorize the superintendent to submit to the Massachusetts School Building Authority the Statement of Interest form dated March 15th, 2018, for the Fort River Elementary School located at 70 Southeast Street, Amherst, Massachusetts, 01002, which describes and explains the following deficiencies and the priority categories for which an application may be submitted to the Massachusetts School Building Authority in the future. Priority 1, building jeopardizes student health, poor health and learning environment. Priority 5, modernization of school facility systems, poor energy efficiency and poor operating efficiency. Priority 7, obsolete building, poor educational space utilization, and hereby further specifically acknowledges that by submitting the Statement of Interest form, the Massachusetts School Building Authority in no way guarantees the acceptance or the approval of an application, the awarding of a grant, or any other funding commitment from the Massachusetts School Building Authority, or commits the City, Town, Regional School District to filing an application for funding with the Massachusetts School Building Authority.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Okay, thank you.
So for the roofing, our method for surviving until 2032 or sooner is to approach the problems that are most significant, most damaging to the facilities further, so we can kind of keep the situation under control. So what we're running into is we had slush on the roof for the day before the rainstorm, and then the rain hit. The drains are all plugged up, so the water backs up across the roof, which brings forth every possible crack, tear, leak. The roofing fundamental, the actual membrane, cannot be sustained for any length of time. So we've got several small jobs in the $20,000 or $30,000 range to patch. We're going to be able to take an infrared view of it, find where the leaks are, do the best we can with the money that we have. It's not going to be sufficient. We're going to continue with interesting fixes for the leaks that actually do come through, and we will just continue to chase the problems. Barring a complete resurfacing, it's just going to be an ongoing effort forever. So that's where we are.
Thank you.
Any further details?
Yeah, I think in that capital, the report that was out of last year's capital, there was a request for a report on what it would take to replace the Fort River roof, and the number came in around $1.9 million. So I know when we look about the long-term capital plan, that,
Correct.
I'm trying to think what year, 22?
I believe in 20. In 20, we designed Fort River, I think.
Yeah,
Don't
yeah,
hold
I'm
me to
talking about
that.
Fort River, yes, I'm sorry.
The next year, we build, and I'm at the $2.5 million level because of inflation.
Yeah.
Unforeseen conditions, just further deterioration. The next year, we designed Wildwood, and again, 2.5 million. So over the next 4 years, we'll design and build. And yes, we're going to gain some economies of scale in designing one versus the other.
Right.
But that's on the 10-year capital plan that
Exactly.
has been shared with the town.
So, assuming that we don't move very quickly with the SOI, the MSBA process, and we don't come up with any creative practical solutions, I think is what you called them, and we're faced with having to replace this roof within
Yes.
the next few years at a higher rate, so 2.5 million or whatever. If then the MSBA is to accept our statement of interest and we start to go down that path, and assuming the feasibility building committee and all that sort of goes into proper alignment, we are potentially looking at an expense that we can't recoup, right? I mean, this roof would go wherever the building goes.
Yes.
It's not something that can be reused in any facility, in any way.
Correct.
It's not anything that can. Okay.
Correct. So in a parallel situation, the boilers can. So we're designing the boilers specifically so they can be picked up and moved should that become.
The boilers can be
possibility.
removed and taken to a different facility or reused.
Well, that's what we're trying to pay attention. What will happen is we'll put $20,000 in this year and $40,000 in next year, and eventually it's going to cost you more to patch it on an ongoing basis than replace it. The economy is just going to catch you. 5, 6, 7 years down the road, I think we're going to be in trouble if we don't make a substantive investment. And that will cause the remainder of the building to deteriorate so rapidly that it'll be of no value.
Right.
So we're caught in a no-win path.
I don't think I understood what you said. So replacing the roof will cause the rest of the building?
No, if we don't replace the roof. So
Okay.
if we continue that.
It's so good, it crushes it.
Well, what will happen is we will spend so much money in patching, it's just like your car.
Right.
Yeah.
At some point, you get to the arena where it's just not worthwhile to put any more money into it, and we're rapidly approaching 170,000 miles equivalent on this roof.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so
All
much.
right, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we're now on school safety discussion.
So I was going to do a much briefer summary of what I shared on Monday, if that's agreeable. I know it's a different district, but many of the factors are the same. And I'm not going to do as long an introduction about generalized school safety. So really going to summarize the letter that was sent out to the larger community, which is that we practice safety drills. We work with our local police department in Amherst, who are absolutely wonderful to work with. They're very comfortable in our school environments, and because of their approach, our students and our faculty are very comfortable with the police when they come in and support us with our drills. And especially with the young students and students with disabilities, we're very cautious about how we do drills to make sure they're developmentally appropriate, that students are not scared. We're conscious of students who have faced trauma in their lives, and our counselors are the kind of best conduit to knowing that information, and then also working with the police department to take the appropriate actions so that students are supported in a way that still prepares us for situations that are unforeseen in a way, but also in a way where students don't become scared about being in school, don't be scared by the exercise that we have. So we're highly conscious of that, thinking of Crocker Farm in particular, where we have 3 to 5 year old students with and without disabilities. That looks really different than even the K-6 program, because we're really trying to focus and specialize our approach to our clientele, the students, and what their needs are and what our needs to school, to keep a safe school must be. Our principals, much like at the secondary level, take safety walks with the facilities director, with Mr. McPherson, with members of the police department every year to analyze, their building. There's a checklist that's formed with next steps. So we are every year getting safer and safer and safer, because anytime we resolve one thing, you walk the next year, and this happens during the school day. Sometimes we do it in the summer just before kids get back, but it's much more functionally helpful to do it while the normal school day is approaching. Taking walks, seeing what doors are open, what doors aren't open, what doors are open that shouldn't be open during the school day, where students, if they wanted to, could enter outside adult supervision, particularly at the elementary level. It's a primary focus. We have not integrated the ALICE protocol at the elementary schools, but we actually, what day was that? Monday, had a conversation with Lieutenant Johnson, who you all met, Mr. Shea, principal at Crocker Farm, Dr. Brady from Student Services, and the phone call was actually with Wilmington, Massachusetts, an elementary principal. They've implemented it at the elementary level. It was a wonderful conversation. I was on for a very small bit, and then technical connections, 3-way calls, it didn't work out. So, but they shared a wealth of resources. They have social stories around safety exercises that they've created for younger kids, for older students at the elementary level. And our next step on that, before anything happens, is having a event that the community would be invited to think about what would Alice look like at the elementary level, right? The kind of stories that you read in the Atlantic. There was one recently about,
5-year-olds barricading classrooms. That's Wilmington, as well as our police department, has no interest in going down an approach, and it's not to critique other districts, just we're not interested in doing that. And our elementary staff is highly interested, because of the feedback they've heard from the secondary staff, of getting trained in and empowered in crisis situations to think a little differently than how they've been trained previously. So we're trying to balance the staff needs, safety needs of our schools, with understanding that the elementary level developmental needs of kids looks very different, and how that drill would go if it was to happen in the future with students, which is not a decision that's been determined, would need to look wildly different than it does at the middle school and high school level. And our staff need to be trained. So even thinking of Alice and the more active role staff play when you're responsible for young students, even the adult role is really different than it would be at the high school level, the middle school level. So more soon on that, but it was a useful conversation to find out what other districts have done and how they've approached the unique challenge of a training that involves more simulation than, quiet and lights off, with young students, and they felt like it's been successful. And the biggest thing they said was we had a community event before we even started going down this road, and we gathered community feedback and answered questions that rightfully concerned families had on the front end. We have a dedicated and well-trained staff, and they report and observe things that concern them. We have our protocols, and we have flip books in every classroom in our district. So if there's a sub-in or there's a teacher in a crisis situation, we all, even if we've practiced them, it's nice to have a paper copy that you know where it is, and so we have that. And much like at the secondary level, our mental health supports are very strong. We have a talented team of mental health professionals who know every student, and in the elementary level, including know every family. I can't say, that gets a little more tricky in the high school level, where families are involved in the school directly, a little less. Some of it just kids don't want them there if they're 15. Some kids, I should say. Same could be true for younger students. But at the elementary level, our families are present in the school much more often, being aware of that as well. Much like at the secondary level, we've had elementary staff trained in Dewey Cornell's threat assessment. I think it's worth noting also the more recent change about the election, that we had some discussion and feedback from community members about election day safety. We had a threat assessment done by the Amherst Police Department, and we've made some changes, not just the Crocker Farm one, which was the higher concern one, but also at Wildwood and at Fort River, about where the Fort River literally changed its voting location to be in a safer space. And in both schools, the traffic flow during that day is something that we're actively talking about and working on. Our next steps, much like at the secondary level, making sure our PA system works in every building, every room and space inside the building, as well as extends outside. Mr. Nakajima and I heard that today, actually, when we were over at the high school. It was working well, because we were pretty far from the building as we heard the PA system. We continue to think about Fort River and Wildwood's infrastructure in terms of the gap, the space gap between the front entrance and the office. While we do have visual contact a little better than the middle school, and there's not stairs, it's still not designed in a way with safety. Those buildings weren't designed with safety being on the minds of the designers. It was 1970 and 1973, or 69 and 73. So it's something that we actively talk about. And I think down the road, to Mr. Demling's point, it's hard to know what the future holds. And if the buildings are staying the same or getting renovated, even a modest one might imagine a shifting of where that happens. In the prior building project, I know the renovation scheme did move the office to where the art rooms are in both buildings. Do that sans other renovation would be a pretty hefty price tag, because the equipment, the PA equipment, all the equipment that's in the office, moving that to facing the external side of the building is no small task. But I think down the road, when we think about infrastructure, that's the primary safety issue that we have in the infrastructure at the elementary level. There are other smaller things. I'm not at all to say we're perfect, but that's kind of the glaring issue that we face at 2 of our 3 schools. And I think I'll stop there, actually, and take questions or feedback or comments.
And I just want to, this is an Amherst meeting, but we did have a extensive presentation on Monday, so if people are watching at home, you could look at the Monday regional meeting for more in-depth discussion and presentation as well. Are there questions for Dr. Morris at this point? Yeah.
Just one quick question. I think God, all these meetings are running together now. There was one conversation that we had about the PA system. I want to say it was at Fort River, having trouble in one particular location of the building. Has that been fixed?
So that was at Crocker Farm, and the
Crocker
challenge
Farm, thank
was,
you.
it wasn't that the PA wasn't announcing in a certain part of the building, it was to get to the PA system, the office staff couldn't do it from their desks. They literally had to get up and move to another, which is not by design, there was a glitch. Like, it wasn't like this has been the situation at Crocker Farm for the last 20 years. There was an argument between the phone company and the alarm company, like that does the PAs, of where the glitch was, and it's now resolved. So the office staff can do the PA back from their seats.
So all PA systems in all the schools are working appropriately at this point?
We still have more work to do in terms of exterior spaces. We still have more work to do. There are some interior spaces that getting the sound modulation correct has been really hard because you don't want to have it blasting in a quiet moment, but with elementary age students in quads, it can be a challenge to get that right when there's sometimes 3 or 4 classrooms all listening from the same PA. So if you make it so loud that every time someone drops off their violin, the quad can't hear for, it becomes, right? So how to do that is an ongoing challenge that we're working on, but I know Mr. McPherson's working with the principals, and it's something that ongoing, they've shared with him the areas of concern that they hear from staff are most problematic, and he's methodically going down and working on those challenges.
Great, thank you.
There was mention of a system of digital communication between staff and the police department,
Yeah.
and is that also true at the elementary school?
It is not.
It is
We have not. The high school is the only school that has, it's been our trial run. The middle school would be the next. I know Dr. Bodie feels strongly about at least investigating that for the middle school level. We have not gotten to the place of investigating that at the elementary level to date.
But it might be a direction.
It could be.
Possibly, depending on the appropriateness.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? No? Okay to move on? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So, okay, adjustments to SBC membership. So this is something that was brought up at our last meeting. There have been some openings, some vacancies that are developing on the school building committee, and there was a question about how what the most appropriate way for those to be filled would be, given that there was a very obviously robust process with this committee to select the composition and membership of the school building committee. So the question was that I think, and I'm going to ask Mr. Nakajima to sort of fill us in on where they are and concerns and strengths and all that sort of thing about what's going on. But I think that they're looking for some guidance about, how we want to be part of that, or how we want to hand that off, or what kind of guidance we might offer. So could you first just sort of talk a little bit about where the SBC is with this and how this has come to be and how it's going?
Yes,
Give us a little update as well, if you'd
I'd be
like.
happy to. And in case there are any, obviously I'm welcome any questions, but in case there are any gaps in the specifics of what I want to say, every single meeting, not only is there a website, which is a repository and will continue to improve as a repository for all materials that are utilized by the committee, all obviously agendas and minutes and materials that are presented or used within meetings, but on top of that, through the extraordinary work of dedicated volunteers, Amherst Media films and broadcasts our meetings. So in fact, if you feel like I am overly concise and you want to watch a couple-hour meeting, you are welcome to do that, and I acknowledge Tony Cunningham, who's in our audience still, here, not watching this on tape, but actually excited to be here in person, is also the person who's volunteering to film all of our meetings. So we've had a bunch of them. We are currently, a couple things. One, we are currently finishing up an RFQ for professional services for the feasibility study itself. There's a working group that's been putting a lot of effort into that, and has been working with the committee as a whole, of course, in open meeting, reviewing each draft and refining it. I've found in that process this is just my personal opinion, it's not a voted position of the School Building Feasibility Committee, is that I think the contributions by all the members have really been very positive and extraordinary up to this point. I think both the community, I'm forgetting the titles of the different categories we had. I'll break it down in different ways. The parent/community members, I think, have added a lot to the conversation and have really dug into a lot of the details. I think those who are on the committee who are working within the district or myself with the school committee role have played an important role. And then I think the project managers/architects folks who are on there have also brought really extraordinary insight from their professional lives into the work. I am happy Jim McPherson exists because him as well as Anthony Delaney, who does procurement, have added just their expertise, which has been extraordinarily useful. So it's been productive. We're close to locking down an RFQ draft that would go out I think the date on it currently says June. I'm not sure why it says June or whether it's going to say some earlier date, because we're actually pretty far along in that process. I think those might be placeholder dates. So we're nearly done with that. Yes?
So just, can you clarify what the RFQ is? You said professional services, but you didn't specify what.
Oh, I'm sorry, for the
role.
feasibility study itself. So it would be the basket of professional competencies that would include a designer, an architect, an engineer, traffic.
Include the OPM or no?
It would not include an OPM because the scale of by agreement of the group,
We're not
the
there
scale
yet.
of the
We're not there
project
yet.
that does not include actual sort of construction deliverables or the next step of that, doesn't really need or mandate an OPM. Not that you couldn't use one, but it didn't require it. I say this in a funny way because they agreed to that in a meeting I wasn't at, so I'm speaking about a conversation, I haven't watched the video yet, I'm sorry. I'll go back and watch it. But there was a robust conversation, and I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that decision per se, but in general, the group's working, I think, productively towards getting the elements, including things like a cost estimator for the team, an independent cost estimator to be able to evaluate the costs that the consultant team that is brought on to do the design and design alternatives, all that work. We're thinking through those things too, right?
So are you saying they decided that an OPM is not necessary for this entire scope of this process?
Correct.
So in terms of the role of an OPM and how, particularly around sort of engagement and overseeing all those pieces, is that going to be part of this basket?
It is part of that basket.
Okay.
And you were part of this conversation, I wasn't. I can guess what the rationale would be, that if you have an architect or a designer, frequently they act as primes for large design and architecture projects anyways, and essentially they often have OPMs that are part of their team, but the reality is if you've done planning projects, you know that if you have an architect, designer, prime, they frequently have the competencies that are essentially managing all the subconsultants who are doing the environmental, traffic, and other kinds of work. And so my point is, it's not that you're not actually having the competency of someone who essentially is managing the team, managing the public process and outreach. It's just a different firm is identified as doing that. Is that?
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing I'd add is that there's been a communication subgroup, or working group, that has taken on a lot of the role of setting up the website and done an incredible amount of work. And so I think the committee itself feels really passionately around communication and feels like while it's a lot of effort, that there's a lot of local expertise, resources, and capacity within the building committee.
So that's particularly on communications, but in terms
Yeah.
of managing
Sorry,
the
yeah,
team,
Yeah, but that's excellent.
the prime would expect it to do that as well, and typically they have that competency.
Yeah.
And so that is on, and I should add that although they're working on refining the timeline of the scope of services for that consulting team that we're going to be soliciting for, the concept put forward is that work would be completed in 5 or 6 months from the point of execution of the contract, which still puts us within the year in terms of the deliverables we'd expect back from that group. In addition, Mr. McPherson left, but he is in fact, and Anthony Delaney as well, are very close to locking down procurement for professional services. It's not called an RFQ, there's some other term for it. That would seek firms to do an environmental or sort of health analysis. I mean, calling it health, but I say environmental, it doesn't mean wetlands, it means mold and air quality and stuff like that. Analysis, which should be done at 2 different time points. One later this spring, an additional time point would be in the fall. Each test is probably more information you need or want, but according to Mr. McPherson's analysis, he identified 14 points for testing within the Fort River building that he felt confident would if done at both time points, would provide more than sufficient information to be able to evaluate the air quality and other, mold, health, radon related conditions within the building. And so that's going to be executed and done soon. We're actually going to be meeting next week to probably finalize, because the purchasing for that service comes out of this committee. We're going to be approving that in all likelihood next week, so that we can be on a timeline to get the services in to do the analysis during some kind of a wet period this spring in Fort River. And also when students and staff are in the building, because the environmental conditions should require that you have the people in the building, and also it's being used and all that kind of stuff, as well as mold outside. So those are the 2, in addition to communications, those are the 2 main activities that we're driving forward with now. What we've had is we had a couple of drop-offs on the committee. One, which I think people are aware, that Claire McGinnis is leaving our town to go work for the Franklin County Council of Governments. So the town hall needs to replace that person. I don't know if you have any update, or you don't have to.
Yeah, I mean, I did speak to the town manager, and we agreed. Some of the conversation tonight will dictate this, but the town manager and I both had the similar ideas as to who might replace that person.
Okay.
Just, we have to figure out
But
which
so
body
there's
does.
a town person, ideally in finance, who would need to be on the committee, and that's the town manager's decision, really. And then we lost both of our educator staff volunteers for the committee, and Nicole Singer did a wonderful job as a chair for a while, but wasn't able to continue to commit to work on the committee. And so there was at least one, if not 2 communications that went out to request volunteers to either from staff or educators, meaning paras or teachers, to join. And we only received 1 application for either of those slots. And so the challenge, my message on this, because I recognize, just based on people talking to me, I recognize that there's concern as to, is the committee making progress? Are they actually getting things done? Are they working well together? And then also, hey, I hear there are vacancies, and I know no one's said this to me, but the worrisome implication could be, are things like falling apart. And so my first point would be, people are actually working very productively. We actually are getting things done and moving our project forward, which is important to do. The members of the committee have all been very engaged, and we've gotten great support from the principal, from the superintendent, from people from the town, the community folks who are involved. But we do, in fact, have a couple of vacancies that need to be filled. One of the challenges, we only got 1 person to step forward, and I'm not characterizing anything wrong with that person at all. I'm just saying, so when you think of you look at bounty of riches, where you'd say we have 10 people who want these 2 slots. Oh my God, how are we ever going to decide? We're sort of facing the opposite problem. So there are 2 issues that the committee was concerned about coming back to you with. One is, does the committee move forward with trying to fill these slots themselves, or is this something that the school committee wants to do, and it's up to really us to figure out, or us to figure out? And then they're looking for guidance. And then the second point would be, even if sort of the mechanical question is resolved of who makes the actual decision, Is there anything people can come up with, or is any thoughts the superintendent has, to how we get more people, staff members, to step up and volunteer? And I'm not criticizing them, they're working very hard. We're in a year in which we're talking about really bad budgets and tight circumstances. It's not an issue of blame, it's more of an issue of urgent need that we feel the need to have that input on the committee. So those are the two questions.
Right, thank you. So I think from here, maybe I'm looking for two things. One is, I expressed last time that my inclination here, and I'm just going to say that right out because it's late, is
Please, yeah.
and this is, please, disagreement is welcome, of course, but that I do feel that we had a very robust process for selecting the committee, the Fort Worth Feasibility School Building Committee members. And because that process was so strong, I feel quite comfortable with officially giving them the ability to select a member, to fill a vacancy, and especially under the circumstance where we did such a clear job of delineating what those roles would be, that this is not just sort of, randomly pick someone from it. It's very specific, and in fact, there aren't enough applicants. So that's sort of where I'm standing on this. I am certainly open, so I'd like to sort of have a discussion about that, make a decision, and give a formal go ahead one way or the other to the school building committee via Mr. Nakajima, and then if we have suggestions, or Dr. Morris has suggestions for how we might sort of encourage people to step up, if there are sort of creative ways we could make that not as, maybe divided up among a couple people, if there are creative ways we can make the role not be quite so onerous for somebody who is willing to maybe volunteer sometime. And I recognize it's 9:37, so, yeah.
So just very quickly, yes. I think we did go through this very long process, and I actually feel that the committee had identified roles, not necessarily the individuals, right? Because what we did was we said, here are the people that we want to have fill the slots in the school building committee, and these are the reasons why. But the actual names were selected, more or less randomly out of a hat. So, to me, I feel that the school building committee, they have my full faith that they can come up with the right approach to get these people. The one thing that I would say is that the building committee should feel free to use the school committee to help promote the search. And so if there is an opportunity for us to, put out, flyers, again, use our networks, help run the word as much as possible, that I feel we should do that, because I think it is urgent that we fill these roles and these slots, and that, we find people who are willing to serve and who can serve. And I would say that also, I think, yes, educators have, it's a difficult budget year. They already have a lot on their plates. We ask a lot of them, and this is also very important. So if, I myself, and of course I'm not speaking for anyone else, but I would be comfortable with having educators split their time. So I think what we're looking for really is that input from folks who are in the building. If the school building committee decides that it's okay to have some changes, among the people who are showing up to these meetings from that particular subset, because they are already so taxed for time and they have, a lot of other factors going on, I would feel comfortable with that kind of an arrangement from the building committee. But again, it has to be something that they endorse and that they feel comfortable with. And if it meets their meeting needs, I would be okay with that.
Yeah.
So yes, and yes. I think especially because we have such strong school committee presence on this subcommittee, it's technically a subcommittee, I don't have any concerns that all of a sudden it's going to go off the...
Point of order, it's not, I don't think it's technically a subcommittee. Is that right?
What?
It's not technically a subcommittee of us.
Oh, yeah, you're correct.
It's its own, yeah.
I thought you were objecting to the
I got to
strong
do a
membership.
point of order. So excited.
I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Since we have such strong school committee presence on this building feasibility committee, there's no chance that it's going to go off the rails and not, honor the roles that we define.
I think so.
So I'm comfortable with that, and with the arrangement that Ms. Ordonez has just described. I think when the initial concern was brought up about the time splitting, there was like a really kind of unknown about how the building committee would be operating. But when you're talking about the people who are actually going to these meetings all the time, making the judgment call of whether that particular role can be, that's a much more knowledgeable perspective, and so I would be comfortable with that knowledge. And thank you, Mr. Nakajima, for the update on the committee. That was very helpful.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that anytime. You can put it on the agenda whenever you want.
Great. Dr. Morris.
So just, not my decision, but I agree. I would endorse the concept of the school building committee filling its membership. I think in the second one, with the staff piece, to be candid, the feedback I've heard from staff members is, is not as directly connected to their role as an educator. And, I think like any initial meetings of any body, particularly a building committee, it's a lot of, reading RFQs, right? It's not necessarily enticing to all folks, especially who are strapped for time. So I just wonder, and this is more for the building committee perhaps to consider, if there can be specific times when staff input is valued, and for there to be opportunities for staff to come and offer feedback instead of having a rotating membership as a voting. I just worry that if it's rotating every third meeting, when the vote happens, people aren't going to feel informed and feel really good about voting because they've missed meetings for 6 weeks or 4 weeks. So I get the intent of it. I just worry a little bit about the pragmatics of it. And that's based on some feedback I've heard from faculty about, glad that's happening. Nicole updated us or someone updated us. Really glad that there's no lack of enthusiasm that there's a building committee. It's more what's the direct connection for people with limited time to be able to take that on. So this is going back to an idea I think you brought up 6 months ago, right, when we were talking about building committee formation, more than that. Is there some advisory board of teachers, or is there some way that people don't have to commit to being a member and staying up to date enough where they take binding votes? I mean, their vote matters. But that there's a feedback mechanism with staff that doesn't have to be individualized to 1 or 2 or 3 members, but it's actually built into the structure of the building committee, so that staff voice matters, but it doesn't have to be focused on a small number of people who already feel taxed for time.
Yeah.
So, one, I agree with what everyone has said, except for the strong representation from the school committee on the feasibility committee side. It makes me feel awkward. I think collectively we do a good job, the group. 2, what I think we should just do is I'll bring back as advice I'll bring back the whole message, obviously, from the school committee, but I'm going to bring back the advice to the feasibility committee that they need to put on the agenda for one of their meetings, thinking about how to engage in creative ways to engage educators and staff to get feedback, and that can mean anything from identifying someone who can be on the committee regularly to thinking about creative ways, because the bottom line is if no one's going to, we do have a volunteer, but I'm saying if in general we can't sustain regular membership and participation, then we're going to have to figure something out, right? And I think that's the mode, I think, in which the committee will work. So I appreciate this very much, and I will take it back, and again, I'm happy to give updates and even bring show and tell materials whenever
PowerPoints.
you want.
Yeah. Okay. And is that enough?
For
Sufficient.
me, yeah.
Okay, great. Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. We have some gifts. I think we do, right?
I didn't think we did.
Or am I'm blurring. Okay, I'm blurring packets. I apologize. I remember seeing them.
It was an
somewhere in the
elementary
list.
PGO that gave a regional gift, so I think that might be.
Oh, that's probably what it is.
When I first saw that gift, I
Are
thought
there
it was wrong.
signatures needed on that?
Are there signatures on
I
that?
just don't like to do it during
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
You do it after.
I mean,
Okay.
welcome
So, school committee planning. Anybody have any commentary they need to do on this? Virtue things. I did write how to ensure preschool program works for all students. That was something that was added. Yeah.
I was just going to add the IEP input that you had mentioned earlier for a future meeting. Did you want to?
IEP input.
We were, you had raised it saying that for the next meeting that we should, now I'm blanking on what it is.
It relates to
Sorry, 'cause it's so
preschool?
late. Yes, I think so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Preschool, yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have that written down. I'm sorry. I had to meet the needs of students with special needs.
Yeah,
and-
exactly.
Yep. I had, the next time this body meets, I'll have been to multiple dual language schools. Have had multiple feedback sessions. So I think just keeping, I'll have to think of a name. I'm open to suggestions. I'm really bad at that. But just eventually it shouldn't be the response to enrollment working group update. But that's how it's written down on my notes right now. But I think, there'll be quite a bit to share because there's quite a number of things in the next 3 weeks that are planned.
How about the Yellow Brick Road? No, just kidding. I'm just kidding. Sorry. This is one thing that, it's a little awkward. I'm not sure how it fits with planning, but back sometime we agreed that we would reach out to Stan Moulton at the Gazette about writing another piece, and that would be appropriate after, sort of at this point where we are. He didn't have any time because of the charter debate that's going on until the 30th. And that's something that's, the one previously was written by the chair and the vice chair. At the 30th, I will no longer be the chair. So I could compose such a thing prior to the 27th, or I could happily pass it. I don't want to do anything inappropriate. I also want to offer my services so that other people don't have to do it if they don't want to, kind of thing. So I don't know if anybody has any. I mean, I don't think we have we don't have another meeting before then. So I sort of want a little, yeah.
Are we, so we're sure that, I guess, the bulletin can't take it and can't?
We reserved the 30th.
Yeah, we reserved
Oh,
the
Reserved
okay.
it. He's waiting. He's prepared for
I
us.
was going to say,
He's got
also,
no
given
room.
your hard work and your work on the enrollment working group, I'd be perfectly happy if you were drafting something.
Yeah.
I'm
All right,
just,
are people
just
comfortable with
don't
that?
know how-
Yeah, in fact, I think it would be very appropriate, given the
Okay.
fact that,
I just didn't want to do anything that felt
Yeah.
uncomfortable to anybody.
Well, you know what you need to do? Make sure you write it while you're chair.
Exactly.
And maybe even work with Anastasia and submit it while you're chair.
Yes.
Right. That's-
So that
yeah.
there's no
Yes.
way possibly you're arrogating authority upon yourself
Yeah.
you don't otherwise have.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
As
I
an
think that
ordinary
we can
citizen.
definitely pull that off.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's all that I have.
Okay.
Do I have a motion? Yes.
Can I move to adjourn?
You may.
Second.
All right, all those in favor? All right,
Here's your gavel.
adjourned.
Thank you.
9.
Sean, what are you doing?
So we have to just,
What on earth are you doing?